Good morning. Welcome to the full committee markup of the fifth bill, the Ag Bill. As you know, we're in the middle of a very, very busy week, hopefully a productive one. We pushed our sixth bill through subcommittee last night, the Homeland Security Bill, and we hope to approve the seventh, the Defense Bill, in subcommittee tomorrow. But most pressingly, later today, we have the Commerce, Justice, Science Bill on the floor. And I ask that you please try this morning to keep your remarks as brief as you can and to the point and respectful of our limited time, because the Commerce, Justice Bill will be back on the floor, and it would preclude us doing business here. So, let me now turn to the chairman of the Ag Subcommittee, Mr. Adderholt, to present his bill to the committee.
Thank you, Chairman Rogers, for yielding. And you have before you this morning the 2015 Appropriation Bill and Report for Agriculture, Rural Development, Food and Drug Administration and related agencies. It was reported as it was reported by the subcommittee on May 20th. At our subcommittee markup, on May 20th, Ranking Member Farr said that 90% of this bill is good. He said 10 was not so good. So even though we disagree on 10% or maybe even less, I'm pleased to say that we have a bipartisan grade of A for this bill. So I want to thank the Ranking Member for his cooperative spirit, for all his work, all that of his staff, and bringing this bill before us today. I want to express my appreciation for our subcommittee members for participating in our hearings, sharing in their ideas, concerns, and as they help to develop this bill as we move forward. Of course, none of this would be possible without Chairman Rogers and Ranking Member Lowy. Their commitment to regular order for this annual appropriations process has been very important as we move on today. Let me just highlight some of the things and the overall issues with this bill. The bill equals $142.5 billion. This is $1.5 billion below the President's request, $3 billion below FY14 enacted level. The bill includes $2.8 billion in discretionary budget authority, which is the same as FY14 enacted level. Mandatory spending totals $122 billion or $3 billion. That is below the FY14 level. These mandatory funds support USDA's farm conservation, crop insurance, and the nutrition programs. Again, let me just highlight a few of the things in the bill. We have a total of $2.6 billion for agricultural research. We received many letters requesting support for land-grant colleges and universities. We were able to provide level funding for these institutions. We also provide $325 million as requested for the Agriculture and Food Research Initiative. We provide $870 million for the Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service as they work to eradicate plant and animal diseases. Because of the efforts of Ranking Member Farr, Congressman Rooney, and Valdeo, pleased to say that we're able to combat the citrus greening disease. Also, we have increased funding in a couple of accounts within the bill for the viral epidemic in pig populations that will supplement emergency funding that the administration is expected to release for research and surveillance purposes. I know Mr. Latham was very instrumental in that and very helpful with calling our attention to that. I thank the members who showed interest in the bill where we tried to place some special emphasis on some things that's really getting of high-profile attention. Over $1 billion for food safety and inspection services. This is approximately the same as the FY14 level, but $3.8 million above the request. It will remain more than 8,000. Will maintain more than 8,000 inspectors and more than 6,000 meat, poultry, and egg plant facilities across the country. We're providing $1.5 billion for the FSA, Farm Service Agency, and it does not allow for any closure of offices, which was a concern. I know Mr. Nunley had expressed some concern about that, as we all had concerns about it, and that being addressed. We're fully funding the various loan programs. The Natural Conservation and Resource Conservation Services are provided $869 million, and that will help farmers, ranchers, and private forest owners to conserve and to protect their land. Representative Cole, let me say you'll be pleased that we increased the funding to help rehabilitate small dams, which I know you had an interest in. The district I represent is a rural district. I know firsthand that the rural parts of a country face unique challenges. This bill is one of the only one of 12 that truly focuses on rural America. And as such, we provide $2.6 billion for rural development programs. This includes funding to support $881 million in business and industry loans, $1.3 billion in loans for rural water and waste programs, and $6.2 billion for rural electric and telephone infrastructure. We also provide more than $1 billion for the single-family direct loan program, $1.1 billion for rental assistance, and $30 million for mutual and self-help program. At times, we have questioned USDA's commitment to rural development programs, as we have seen cuts as they are proposed in rural housing. However, there's a strong support for them in the House of Representatives, and I appreciate everyone who expressed support for that program. The bill includes both discretionary and mandatory funding for USDA food and nutrition programs. In particular, we have $6.6 billion for the Women's, Infants, and Children's program. That's $93 million below the FY14 enacted level and $200 million below the budget request. But the committee has not decreased just for the sake of saving money. This is because of declining caseload and large carryover balances from the previous year. That is acknowledged by USDA, OMB, and CBO. So every person who is eligible for the program will receive the benefits under its current funding. The bill includes $20.5 billion in required mandatory funding for child nutrition programs and $82.3 billion for the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program known as SNAP. This funding will help more than 47 million Americans across the country. To support those that are in have crisis and real special needs than other parts of the world, Syria, South Sudan, and the Central African Republic, the bill provides $1.7 billion for overseas food aid. Pleased to say the report was able to provide $66 million increase for Food for Peace grants and $13 million for the McGovern-Dole Education and Child Nutrition Program that is over the budget request by finding savings that were offset, that would offset that increase. The Food and Drug Administration receives $2.6 billion in discretionary funding in this bill. This is an increase of $23 million over the FY14 level. When the user fees are included, FDA will receive $4.5 billion for FY15. So within the total, the committee provides $25 million increase. The full amount that requested by the food safety activities in the President's budget, and the drug safety activities are increased by $12 million. The bill includes $218 million for the Commodities Future Trading Commission. This is an increase of $3 million above last year's level and is intended to address the needed information regarding technology that is really needed over at the Commodities Future Trading Commission. Before I close, I do want to address one issue that is probably in that 10% that Mr. Farr will disagree with me on, and that is a provision that will allow schools to temporarily seek a waiver from the current school lunch standards. That is if and only if a school has lost money over a 6-month period as a result of trying to implement the new regulations. We've had calls, we've had emails, we've had meetings over the past year from school nutritionists. Some of us know us affectionately as the lunch ladies. We've talked with teachers and administration, and parents are also concerned about this issue. It's a very real problem in many school districts across the country. It may not be in some, but it is in several. And the bill acknowledges the concerns of these schools and responds to that flexibility. Last year in our bill, we put a language in the bill to tell the Secretary he could have that flexibility, and he told us he didn't have the flexibility, so we're giving this under the law. Please note it's very important that the language only allows schools more time if they need it. It does not change the standards. It does not amend the underlying law in any way. In fact, the bill allows something very similar to the flexibility that USDA announced just last Tuesday regarding the whole grain requirement. I'm sure we'll talk more about this as the day goes on. But again, this I can only stress that it only applies to schools only if they need more time. This does not roll back current law. The subcommittee members worked very hard to incorporate the funding priorities into both sides of the aisle. And I want to mention the Ag Appropriations staff that are sitting behind me on the minority and the majority side. They worked very long hours. As you know, these bills don't come together overnight. It takes a long time to really put these bills together and prepare for the hearings and all that goes into it. So we appreciate their hard work and the long hours they put in. Thanks for your attention on this. I think it is a good bipartisan legislation, and I look forward to us reporting this bill to the House floor. I yield back.
Mr. Farr.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank my friend Mr. Adderholt for how he's chaired this committee and marking up this bill. It's really the U.S. Department of Agriculture, the Futures Commodity Trading Commission, Food for Peace around the world. These are very important programs, and essentially the Rural America programs. This is the department that reaches out to rural America. So I want to thank you and your leadership in being able to follow the footsteps of Jack Kingston and marking up a good bill. As you said, and I said in the markup in committee, that it's 90% a great bill, but 10% is bad, really bad. And I'll have an amendment to address that in a moment. What I love about serving on this committee and serving in Congress is we all got elected to solve problems. And this is the committee that makes solving problems possible because we fund the solutions. And without our action, we can't get it done. We got elected to make tough choices, and we did, particularly on health care. What a big cost it was to America. Not everybody agreed with how the solution came out, but I think everybody in this room agrees that it was a huge problem with runaway costs. And one thing we debated throughout that discussion on how we reform health care in America was the bottom line was how do we grow healthy people so that they don't get sick and get into this costly system that we have. And it begins with nutrition and exercise. And the 10% of this bill that's bad destroys just that very effort that we've made. It takes away the ability for schools, give schools an opt-out, saying you don't have to participate in the school lunch program if it's hard. Well, we don't tell kids, look, you don't have to take math if it's hard or science if it's hard. You don't have to do PE if it's hard. This opt-out for nutrition is just the wrong way to go, particularly at this moment in American history when we're really trying to figure out how we can raise a healthier society. Now, they'll argue, well, there's plate waste. Well, look, duh. Anybody here that's a mom or dad knows about plate waste. Plate waste begins at home. There's plate waste in our own cafeterias here in Congress. There's plate waste in the military cafeterias. There's plate waste all over America. It's a big problem. It's a big problem. We ought to address it. We throw away about half the food or more that's prepared in America every day in a world where many, many people don't have anything to eat. So we ought to be addressing it. But to say that because it's a problem in schools, because we've changed the menu and you got to eat healthy stuff, that you can opt out from that, that's just wrong. It's wrong leadership. We did the Child Nutrition Act several years ago to make sure that we got healthy foods in the schools. I was a forest firefighter when I was younger, and you know, on the forest fire lines today, they have a nutritionist at the fire camps. They don't serve junk food to people that are first responders. They don't serve junk food to people who are in the military. They want those bodies to be the instrument of trying to solve the problem. And if it's unhealthy, it can't do that. People can't even qualify to get in the military now because of weight. It's a huge problem. So the 10% of this bill that is bad is really bad. But Mr. Adderholt and I are great friends. We met on this committee on a Codell going to Bosnia many, many years ago. And your wife was pregnant at the time, and it was your first child. And I remember we were talking about, because I just had my first grandchild. And we've had a friendship ever since. And Mr. Rogers, I think you've done a great job of keeping the trains running on time. I just hope that this bad baggage car doesn't make it to the end. Thank you.
The metaphors are flying today. This bill, of course, makes many great investments in the people of the country, their safety, their livelihoods, their communities. Our farmers and ranchers, of course, play an integral part in our marketplace and in our national well-being. Food to the table, products to our stores, revenue to the economy. And it's our congressional duty to make sure that our ag interests are successful, productive, and safe. To this end, the bill funds USDA programs that help our farmers and ranchers boost productivity, fight animal, plant, and crop diseases, improve water quality, and conserve and protect farmland. The bill also funds important programs for rural development that American communities rely on. By providing $2.6 billion for these programs, we can help foster an environment for economic growth, supporting rural infrastructure, increasing opportunities for rural businesses by providing loans, and helping balance the playing field in local housing markets. These communities are vibrant parts of America's past and should remain so into our future. Another chief priority in the bill, of course, is the safety of our food and drug supply. Legislation includes an increase for FDA food safety activities of $25 million. That includes $1 billion to maintain 8,000 frontline inspection personnel for meat, poultry, and egg products and facilities across the nation. Drug safety activities are increased by $12 million in the bill. I'm particularly pleased that the legislation pushes the FDA in the right direction on the development of abuse-deterrent formulations for narcotics and other emerging technologies to help fight the epidemic of prescription drug abuse in the country, something the CDC calls a national epidemic. The numbers of deaths caused by prescription drug abuse. As you may or may not recollect, the FDA just recently approved a new opioid called Zohydro, 5 times more powerful than Vicodin, highly addictive, a great pain reliever for terminally ill patients, but easily abused, highly addictive, almost impossible to kick the habit. They released that drug without any abuse-deterrent properties. You know, OxyContin was a scourge 10 years ago, until the company that makes it was forced to make it so that you could not crush it and shoot it up and get that 12-hour high in a split second. And I thought the FDA was on the path to require that any opioid that they approve would be required to have these abuse-deterrent characteristics. Until out of the clear blue, after the advisory committee voted 12-2 against releasing Zohydro, they voted to release it. I've already had deaths in my district from the overuse of a drug that doctors and people do not understand yet how powerful it is. And this bill tries to hold FDA's feet to the fire on the issuance of approval of opioids without abuse-deterrent characteristics. In addition, this bill also provides support to a variety of nutrition programs that help to make sure our most vulnerable, including the children and the elderly, do not go hungry. In total, discretionary funding in this bill is essentially the same as last year. To achieve that, the subcommittee had to look very closely at each and every program within this bill, make the tough decisions about where to invest and where to trim funding. And I'm pleased that the bill includes many provisions that mandate strong congressional oversight of your tax dollars and improve efficiency in all areas, particularly our nutrition programs. For instance, within SNAP, the bill includes a directive to ban fraudulent retailers, required the enforcement of a ban on certain outreach with foreign governments, and have increased the ability of the agency and Congress to conduct vigorous oversight. As I close, I want to thank Chairman Adderholt, Ranking Member Farr, the subcommittee, and the staff for their hard work in putting this bill together. It took a lot of effort, even up to the last moment, to make sure that we had the best piece of legislation that we could find before us today. Of course, we couldn't be here without the staff. We want to thank all of them for their terrific work as well. I believe, Mr. Chairman, that you've produced a very good bill, one that I unreservedly endorse today, and I kindly ask the committee to do the same. Now, Mrs. Loy will recognize for her opening comments.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate your efforts to move this process forward. And in all the bills, there's really been strong bipartisan efforts. So I thank you for your leadership. And even though we may not like some parts of some bill, we appreciate the process, and I think every ranking member referenced the cooperation with their chair. So I thank you again for your leadership. And in this bill, I want to emphasize again that I appreciate the efforts of Chairman Adderholt, Ranking Member Farr, in putting together this bill. And while many of the funding decisions are appropriate, and I agree, I have deep concerns about controversial riders. First, this bill would begin to back away from much-needed efforts to make school meals healthier. According to the CDC, as of 2012, more than 1/3 of children and adolescents were obese. Obese children are more likely to become obese adults, thus are at much greater risk of developing heart diseases, type 2 diabetes, stroke, and forms of cancer. Such dire health risks necessitate coordinated federal action. Schools should support and teach healthy eating habits. Now, I must say, as a mother and a grandmother, I know from firsthand experience, every adult doesn't love healthy foods. Every kid doesn't necessarily love healthy foods. But I could give you some recipes. There are ways to make these healthy foods more appealing to children and adults. So let's not back away. I see head shaking here in our room because someone here is eating a healthy breakfast. And we know that we can do it. So rather than backing away from it, I would invest more in helping those who run our school lunch programs. I remember when I worked for the state years ago, we funded some school health programs. In fact, what we did is we hired the unemployed. They came into the cafeteria, and we're making healthy foods at the direction of those who were running the program. So we can do it. Let's not back away from it. It may be hard, but we can do it. And I look forward to working to support this part of the bill. Hopefully we can get it back in there, not have the waiver, and just encourage every school lunch program in the country to make healthy foods more appealing. Bill language that would make white potatoes eligible for purchase by WIC participants violates the purpose of the WIC program to only include foods based on documented nutritional deficiency. According to the latest data from the Institute of Medicine, such a deficiency does not exist for white potatoes. When it comes to the WIC food package, we must follow the most current science and data available. The Department of Agriculture also maintains this commitment to scientific integrity, and earlier this year committed to start its review of the WIC package a year early. There's no need for us to revisit this issue once again. Despite these shortcomings, the majority will rectify a terrible problem with the bill we considered in subcommittee in its manager's amendment today, and I appreciate that effort. The summer feeding pilot program would no longer be limited in this bill to only children living in certain rural areas. By restoring the initiative for children in urban, rural, and tribal areas, we can ensure we test the most effective approach for feeding children in low-income families in every part of this great nation during the summer months when meals are not available at school. This is so vital, and I'm so supportive of this effort. It's astonishing to me that there are thousands and thousands of children who do not have access to a school lunch program in the summer, and we must rectify this. This is not a partisan issue, and I look forward to working together to spread this school lunch program to every part of the country during the summer months. I'm concerned that the bill provides only half of the requested funds to expand and improve oversight of drug compounding to ensure products are safe and effective. And I would like to compliment the chairman for increasing funding for the McGovern-Dole Food Aid Program by $13 million and restoring funding for Food for Peace. However, I would have preferred the bill also include the administration's proposal to allow up to 25% of Title II resources to be made available in cash for emergencies to better respond to multiple high-level crises around the world. This change alone would have allowed U.S. aid to reach an estimated 2 million more people in chronically food insecure communities. The bill provides sufficient funds for nutritional assistance programs such as WIC and SNAP, provides needed discretionary funds for food safety programs within FDA and the Food Safety Inspection Service. I also support report language directing the FDA to complete its review of sunscreen active ingredient applications by the end of this year. Lastly, I wish the majority would have fully embraced the work and purpose of the Commodity Futures Trading Commission and fully funded the administration's request. But, as our ranking member said, this bill is moving through the process. I'm delighted that we're moving at such a good speed, and I hope we can improve these shortcomings as this bill moves forward. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Are there further opening statements on the bill? If not, are there amendments? Mr. Chairman.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will read.
Amendment offered by Mr. Adderholt.
We dispense with the
Without
reading.
objection, the reading of the bill is amendment is dispensed with.
Okay.
Chairman's recognized.
We simply have a standard manager's amendment making non-controversial technical and requested changes to the bill and report. The amendment's been drafted in consultation with the ranking member, Mr. Farr, and I would urge the adoption of the amendment.
Mr. Farr.
We accept the amendment.
Further discussion? Hearing none, the question is on the amendment. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed will say no. The amendment is agreed to. Mr. Farr.
Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will read.
Amendment offered by Mr. Farr, strike section.
Waive
Without objection, the reading is dispensed with. The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. A section of this bill, Section 739, undermines a great investment that Congress has made to provide kids with more nutritious food and be a major step backwards for the health of American children. I stated that in my opening comments, and this amendment addresses that. I've passed out letters of support for this amendment from such groups as the National PTA, Parent Teachers Association, Mission Readiness, and the School Nutrition Association's past presidents. And I urge that you read these very informative letters. And I want to point out a passage in the Mission Readiness letter. And it states that the excess body fat has become a leading medical disqualifier for military service. Today, more than 1 in 5 Americans between the ages of 17 and 24 are too heavy to enlist. As a result, hundreds of potential recruits fail the physical entrance exam every month because they are too overweight. In fact, between 2006 and 2011, U.S. Military Entrance Processing Command reported that over 62,000 individuals were turned away because of their weight. Failure to meet weight requirements is not just a problem among potential recruits. The data shows that excess weight impacts those who have already enlisted as well. Every year, the military discharges over 1,200 first-term enlistees before their contracts are up due to weight problems. The military must then recruit and train their replacements at a cost of $75,000 per person, totaling roughly $90 million annually. So, it is a real problem, is our weight problem in America, as I stated. It's probably the #1 driver of healthcare costs, and it's something we can control. And the way you control it is you've set national standards, which we have done with allowing an independent entity to come up with the nutritional guidelines. That isn't political. We don't tell them what to put in those guidelines. We are beginning to amend some of their recommendations as the pressure on Congress is seen. But I think what you have to realize is that the school nutrition standards are developed by independent experts, not by Congress. And over 90% of our schools in this country are saying they're working with this program and getting it done. Some schools are complaining, and Mr. Adholt's totally right about that. But the Department of Agriculture says they'll sit down with these schools and work out something with them. There is no, big penalties here. This is just the fact that, and you know what? These are not the parents. You got the letter from the PTA. I don't think you as parents would be complaining about the fact that schools are serving nutritional foods in the lunchroom. You'd certainly be complaining if they were loosening the academic standards in school. There'd be all hue and cry about that. This is coming from the people that are working in the lunchroom, the lunch ladies, as Mr. Adderholt called them. And I think it's a politic that we don't need to put in a bill to say, okay, schools, you can opt out. They get to keep the money, so they don't have to buy the fresh fruits and vegetables. They get that money, but they're opting out and saying we don't want to buy those things because it's too hard. Well, if 90% of the schools can live with this and doing a good job, I think we ought to make sure the whole nation lives with it. So let's adopt this amendment and support this harmful rider. Congress should know better. Let's put kids' health first. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Chairman Adderholt.
Thank you for yielding. Again, I want to be clear that everybody supports healthy lunches and meals for children. But the bottom line is the schools are finding the regulations to be too much and too quick. School districts need more time to implement the changes. I think the bottom line is I don't believe that the school nutritionists, the lunch ladies and gentlemen that work in the lunchrooms, their mission is to make children fat and obese. They want to provide healthy. I've talked to them. They love these kids. They want to do the right thing, but they also want to prepare foods that actually taste good and that have some taste. Right now, the restrictions on salt, the restriction of how much wheat or the amount of wheat they have to put in there is so restricting. One school district I read about said they had to get out of the program because of a hard-boiled egg having too much fat in it. Over 12 ounces of skim, not whole milk, skim milk, was beyond what they could, was beyond how much fat content. So again, all of us want to have healthy kids, but the bottom line, schools are really struggling, and we have tried to intervene last year to give the Secretary some leeway, some waivers. He said he could not give any waivers. We have support. Mr. Farr mentioned he had support from several groups. School Nutrition Association has come up and support our position. The National School Boards Association has support of our position. The Council on Great City Schools are supporting our position. If the schools are not struggling, if they're financially sound and they are having success, then they don't have to change anything. They can keep operating just as they operate. These are good, hard-working professionals. They're trying to do their best to meet these standards, but they need more time. All that says is this gives them have a 12-month waiver. If they're having financial difficulty, it does not roll back the standards. So I would ask the committee to oppose the amendment.
Is there further discussion? Gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise to speak in support of the amendment. I'm not going to evangelize on eating healthy during this debate, but I do think it's important for us to note the difference between the chairman's argument and reality. And I have tremendous respect for Mr. Adderholt. He was my ranking member when I chaired the Ledge Branch Appropriations Subcommittee, and we are good friends, and our children are friends. So I will say what I'm going to say with respect, but the argument that the chairman just made was about the type of food. The amendment deals with a supposed deficit in funds that school districts are suffering from. Those are apples and oranges. The bottom line is that it appears that the language in the underlying bill is masking the fact that there are many, many school districts, leaders, who seem to not care about what we put in our children's bodies. And that is something that we all have to come to grips with in facing the reality that we do have a massively obese country. We do have a country of citizens who ingest things that are horrifically bad for them. And I am someone who used to eat peanut M&Ms and drink a Coke for breakfast for the better part of a decade. Then I got breast cancer at 41 years old. I won't blame that on what I ate, but it does make you more conscious about what you put in your body, and making sure that when you think about what your children put in your body, particularly when there might be a susceptibility to the experience that you went through, that it seems a small price to pay for us to make sure that what our children are eating at school is healthy, that we don't have to serve them cardboard, it doesn't have to taste bad. And as someone who has recently transformed the way I eat, I've learned that it is very easy to eat healthy and make sure it tastes good. Might require a little extra effort, might even cost a little bit more money. But the benefits down the road to having a less obese country and to making sure that we raise a generation of children who actually naturally decide to grab a fruit or a vegetable as opposed to a Snickers or a cookie is going to end up resulting in benefits that are both tangible and intangible, and also dramatically reduce our health care costs down the road and save lives. So this amendment is a good one. I think Mr. Adderholt is right. We should provide some flexibility, but granting blanket waivers is not the answer. And I think we need to make sure that we go back to the drawing board if we have to make some adjustments for school districts. But the goal is something we should all embrace, and I hope it is something that we do all embrace. Thank you.
Ms. Roybal-Allard.
Mr. Chairman, I rise in support of the amendment that is offered by my colleague from California. Child obesity levels are sky high. Nearly 1 in 3 school children and adolescents in the United States is overweight or obese. And these kids are at increased risk of high blood pressure, cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, asthma, joint problems, fatty liver disease, and social and psychological problems. Because eating healthy, age-appropriate diet is one proven way to impact the obesity crises. And because kids eat up to half of their calories at school, Congress directed the USDA to strengthen nutrition standards for school meals. USDA's new standards are based on the Institute of Medicine's recommendations and instruct schools to include more whole grains and vegetables and less sugar, fat, and salt in their menus. These lunch standards have been in place for 2 years, and 90% of schools are already in compliance, and studies are showing that kids are eating more fruits and vegetables. The USDA is responding to the concerns of these schools that are still struggling, and they are providing technical assistance and flexibility where it is needed. However, the FY15 House Agricultural Appropriations Bill would allow any school district to get a waiver of all the new breakfast and lunch standards, not just the standards for whole grains and vegetables. Unfortunately, as was mentioned, those who claim they are asking for just a little more flexibility, in some cases, just want the flexibility to serve more junk food. There is nothing new about kids complaining about school lunch. Even if kids don't eat their vegetables every night, parents don't stop serving vegetables altogether, and neither should our schools. I urge my colleagues to support Representative Farr's amendment that will maintain and protect the nutritional standards for the school meals program. I yield back.
Ms. Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I rise in total support of Mr. Farr's amendment and thank him for this. And let me just say, I raised 2 sons, and I can tell you that my children would have eaten Snickers and Twinkies for breakfast, lunch, and dinner had they not been required to eat healthier options. The 10% of schools who are not meeting these standards should be assisted in finding ways to meet these standards, not opt out. Let me, for my time, I'd like to read the letter that the First Lady, well, it's an op-ed printed in the New York Times that makes a very compelling case why we should not opt out of this. The First Lady says, when we began Let's Move initiative 4 years ago, we set but one simple but ambitious goal, and that is to end the epidemic of childhood obesity in a generation so that kids born today will grow up healthy. To achieve this goal, we have adhered to one clear standard: what works. The initiatives we undertake are evidence-based, and we rely on the most current science. Research indicates that kids need less sugar, fat, and salt in their diets, so we revamp school lunch menus accordingly. When data showed that the lack of nearby grocery stores negatively affected people's eating habits, we worked to get more fresh food retailers into underserved areas. Studies on habit formation in young children drove our efforts to get healthier food and more physical activity into child care centers. Today, we are seeing glimmers of progress. Tens of millions of kids are getting better nutrition in school. Families are thinking more carefully about food they eat, cook, and buy. Companies are rushing to create healthier products to meet the growing demand, and the obesity rate is finally beginning to fall from its peak among our youngest children. So we know that when we rely on sound science, we can actually begin to turn the tide on childhood obesity. But unfortunately, we're seeing attempts in Congress to undo so much of what we've accomplished on behalf of our children. Take, for example, what's going on now with the Women, Infant, and Children program known as WIC. This is a federal program designed to provide supplemental nutrition to low-income women and their babies and toddlers. The idea is to fill in the gaps in their diets, to help them buy items like fresh produce that they can't afford on their own, and give them the nutrition that they're missing. Right now, the House of Representatives is considering a bill to override science by mandating that white potatoes be included on the list of foods that women can purchase using WIC dollars. Now, there's nothing wrong with potatoes. The problem is that many women and children already consume enough potatoes and not enough of the nutrient-dense fruits and vegetables they need. That's why the Institute of Medicine, the nonpartisan scientific body that advises on the standards for WIC, has said that potatoes should not be part of the WIC program. Unfortunately, this isn't an isolated occurrence. We're seeing the same kind of scenario unfold with our school lunch program. Back in 2010, Congress passed the Healthy Hunger Free Kids Act, and some of us worked on that very closely with the White House and the First Lady, got that passed, signed into law. This set higher nutritional standards for school lunches, also based on recommendations from the Institute of Medicine. Today, 90% of schools report that they are meeting these new standards. As a result, kids are now getting more fruits, vegetables, whole grains, and other foods that they need to be healthy. This is a big win for parents who are working hard to serve their kids balanced meals at home and don't want their efforts undermined during the day at school. And it's a big win for all of us since we spend more than $10 billion a year on school lunches and should not be spending hard-earned tax dollars on junk food for our children. Yet some members of the House are now threatening to roll back these standards and lower the quality of foods our children get. They want to make it optional, not mandatory, for schools to serve fruits and vegetables to our kids. They also want to allow more sodium and fewer whole grains than recommended into school lunches. These issues, of course, will be considered when the House Appropriations Committee takes up the annual spending bill for the Ag Department on Thursday. Remember a few years ago when Congress declared that the sauce of a slice of pizza should count as a vegetable in school lunches. You don't have to be a nutritionist to know that this doesn't make much sense. Yet we're seeing the same thing happening again with these efforts to lower nutrition standards in our schools. Our children deserve so much better than this. Even with the progress we have made, 1 in 3 children in this country is still overweight or obese. 1 in 3 is expected to develop diabetes in his or her lifetime. And this isn't just about our children's health, it's about the health of our economy as well. We already spend an estimated $190 billion a year treating obesity-related conditions. Just think what these numbers will look like in a decade or two if we don't start solving this problem now. Bottom line is very simple. As parents, we always put our children's interests first. We wake up every morning and go to bed every night worrying about their well-being and their futures. And so, Mr. Chairman, I would hope that we would consider Mr. Farr's amendment and try to help figure out a way not to waive these standards, but to help fix the 10% that have found difficulty in meeting the standards. Thank you.
Chairman Kingston.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I yield to Mr. Adderholt.
Let me respond to a couple things. One of the things that's been said is that the school meal program just needs some technical assistance, training and guidance, or is what's needed to implement these new standards. The bottom line is throwing more money at these problems in the form of technical assistance or training is not going to fix the challenges that our schools are facing. Schools have a customer, and that's the students. Training and the technical assistance won't magically make the kids start eating the meal. The new nutrition standards are so complex that since October 2010, USDA has released approximately 200 policy memos to clarify the regulations. No amount of technical assistance, training, or guidance will solve the financial and operational problems that are facing these school meal programs. I'd also like to respond to a couple of the reason I mentioned about the type of foods, and it was mentioned about the hard-boiled egg and about the 12 ounces of skim milk. Is pushing the limit, is that is an example of how complex these standards are and why these schools cannot meet these standards. And this is only a timing issue. This does not completely do away with it. So by voting for or voting keeping with the current law or current bill and opposing Mr. Farr's amendment, it only gives the schools more time to adjust. They are having financial difficulty. I'm talking to the people who work in the lunchrooms. I'm not talking to the kids who don't like, I have talked to the kids who don't like the meals, but but honestly, I'm talking to the adults who serve it, and they don't even want to eat it. And I would dare say that most of you, what you had for breakfast this morning would not meet that standard. You would be sent to detention for what you had this morning. And again, the problem is so onerous that's why we're trying to buy them a little time. The lunch nutritionist, if you've been into school lunches, and if you remember, you wasn't served Snickers and hamburgers every day. That was not what that's not what, in my small town up in northwest Alabama, that's not what the lunch lady served every day. We had turnip greens, and we had all kinds of vegetables, and I think that's the way it is today. And again, this is where the heavy hand of the government's coming down and trying to dictate to local school systems everything about even putting salt shakers on the table. So again, this is just buying time. This is not rolling back any standard that's in place, and I just would like to clarify that and just to indicate how important this is. Now you go back.
Chair wishes to observe that the breakfast snacks being served this morning here in the room undoubtedly would not pass anybody's test. Pistachio nuts, peanuts, crackers. Ms. Capter.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess the best thing we can say about this debate is that it is highlighting an extraordinarily important issue for our country that affects every single district that we represent and every single school. I rise in support of the Farr Amendment and wish to make a couple observations. We shouldn't allow any school to opt out of anything. what we should be doing is encouraging best practices across this country and helping our school systems and those struggling to hold them together to measure up to the nutrition challenge. I recall one conversation I had with the financial director of one of the school systems that I represent. This was years ago when I was lucky to be on the agriculture subcommittee. And his basic answer to me was, Congresswoman, you're talking to me about food. I'm not in the food business. I'm in the education business. And I was so offended. I said, it's that kind of density that is causing the high blood pressure, the diabetes, and the lack of understanding about what good food is. Compared to when I went to school, which was a few decades ago, the schools are full of junk food. All the vending machines, they pay the schools, right, to put the junk in there. If the schools weren't struggling at the local level to try to hold it together, they wouldn't have to have their hands out to put the poison in those machines that these kids eat every day. It's just appalling what goes on in these schools. It used to be we taught kids how to cook. Guess what? They don't teach home ec anymore. Maybe they do in your districts. They don't in Ohio. They can't afford those programs. I've walked with kids gleaning food in the fall, and I've had boys say to me, what is this? These are kids that have been hungry. They don't even know what an eggplant is. They don't know what to do with cantaloupe. We have a crisis across this country in school district after school district after school district, and somebody better pay attention. And I say as a woman, if you look at who feeds most of the people in America, it was interesting, Congressman Adderholt, you said the lunch lady, because it is women who mainly do this at the local level. And I just ask the guys, you know, look at the robin's nest. Who's feeding the baby birds? It's the mother. It's the mother bird, all right? So there is a problem with policy at the national level and not understanding what is happening locally. It is serious. And the local school boards sometimes also don't have people on them and the administrators in these programs who've ever had to feed anybody because somebody always did it for them. It is wrong that in communities that I represent, several urban communities, that greens aren't there. They should be, but they're not. Who figures out who those diets are? We have to have USDA pulling these school districts forward. So I would hope that these gentlemen could work something out so that we would encourage good nutrition, nobody opts out, we encourage best practices, and we help share this across America. Because I'll tell you what, I vote for these dollars every year, and then I see what happens down at the local level and how our best intentions get convoluted. Nobody should opt out. I rise in strong support of the FAR amendment.
Mr. Herrera Butler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise in support of school nutrition for kids and making sure that children have access to adequate nutritional services. I think what we're discussing here today, and we need to keep our issues focused, is how do we do that in the best way? Heard the gentlelady mention best practices. I am all for it. We need some answers on the ground. I'm going to read for you a couple quotes. From a school nutrition services director. She's a registered dietitian for Oregon Public Schools. We are not exactly in the Northwest. We do a lot of fresh stuff. We're all about farm to table. That's part of our pride. So I guarantee you this woman is thinking, breathing, eating, how do we make sure our kids have access to healthy services? Her concerns, the real world concerns of the people on the ground who are trying to implement this program, listen to what they are saying. She said that her costs have gone up for fresh fruit and vegetables. Okay, how much? 31% in price, so from $860,000 to over $1 million. Okay, so we know what we're working with. She said her challenge is then she watches the students leave the serving line, go to the garbage line, and then throw away their fruits and vegetables before they sit down to eat. She said it's really sad. We have to help with that. That's wasting money and wasting nutrition. Okay, second thing. This is from Los Angeles, Unified School District Services Director. He said his issue isn't that they aren't getting the kids to eat it. His issue is that it's how much they have to take. The requirements, referring to the requirements that the students eat at least 3 items for lunch. He said, even I don't eat that much food in a day, let alone a 7-year-old. So I don't hear any of the men on this committee saying we want to take kids' nutritional opportunities away. No, 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 no. We need to figure out how it works for them, and this is what the School Nutrition Services Association has asked of us in terms of getting flexibility. If you all have better ideas about how we help them, not just we need to help them or we need to make best practice. If you have specifics, I'm going to guess that the School Nutrition Services Association is all ears. But we need to be cognizant of the fact that there's a very real problem. And we want to find a solution. I don't want to hear people decrying that we don't want to feed kids. Let's do it in the best way possible. And to this point, this is what they've asked of us. If you can replace it with a better idea, I'm all ears. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Mr. Bishop?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I rise in support of the FAR amendment. I'm very struck by the state of obesity and the lack of health in young people in our country. I'm just reading an article, a missive from the Mission Readiness, Military Leaders for Kids, who point out that there are 450 retired admirals and generals who are associated with Mission Readiness, and they are very concerned that 75% of all young Americans between the ages of 17 and 24 are unable to join our military because they're medically and physically unfit, too poorly educated, or have disqualifying criminal records. And a shrinking pool of young Americans to join our military that will be eligible is a national security threat. The school lunch program, among other things, was started to make sure that we had people who were fit. And this regulation really goes to the point that we have too many young Americans that are too fat to fight. And this policy that's been put in place has begun to address that. I think we need to support it. Now, I understand that there are some school districts, maybe some rural school districts, that are having some difficulty in complying. However, I think that what the language in this bill is doing is really taking a meat axe to solve a problem that could be handled with a scalpel. And so I think that what we ought to do is work together to try to address the specific issues on a technical basis to assist those school districts. But let's don't change the whole rule. Let's don't grant blanket waivers. Let's keep American children becoming more healthy so that certainly we won't have a majority, 75%, that are too fat to fight.
Gentleman's recognized.
Mr. Chairman, the reason that this debate has gone on so long is because there are many of us who understand how serious this issue is.
My nationality.
We have heard a lot in the last couple of years from a lot of folks about what we leave our children and our grandchildren. And most of that has been about the national deficit. Most of that has been about dollars. Most of that has resulted in deep cuts to many programs. And regardless of where you are on that issue, regardless of how you feel about the deep cuts, as I do, I think they've been too deep and too dangerous, you still understand the philosophy or the message of those who believe that you can't pass on to our children and our grandchildren a debt that they can't handle. The contradiction here, and the contradiction in this waiver, if you will, in this language, is that it ignores that there are other harms and difficulties that we can pass on to our children and our grandchildren. If we don't feed them properly, if we don't teach them how to eat properly, if we don't teach them how to exercise, if we don't teach them the best way we can to stay healthy, then we may be passing on a lesser debt, monetarily speaking, but we may be passing on more weight and heart trouble and disease. And eventually, we will have to pay for that. Because when people are not healthy, the society has to pay either at the emergency room, through subsidies, or many other kinds of medical care. So I would hope that as we look at this, and I see some of my brothers on the other side who I see working out incredibly strong every morning at the gym, wherever that gym is. And, and they're in great shape. And yet there's a contradiction that I keep hearing here. One that says we can't pass on a debt, but we can pass on bad health. We can't pass on bad spending habits, but we can pass on bad eating habits. We can pass on a lack of overspending, but we can also pass on a lack of exercise. None of us here eat the way we should, and none of us here exercise as much as we should. But a lot of us try to stay as healthy as we can, to be around the Appropriations Committee for a long time. You know, we need to look at this and not contradict ourselves. And so I repeat, you can't say I don't want to pass on a debt, but I don't mind if people are passed on in bad health in the future and we pass it on to them. And I would hope that there's a way, either right now or on its way to the floor, that we reconsider what we're doing here today. Because the reason you've heard so many people speak on this issue, Mr. Chairman and my colleagues, is because this may be the issue of our time. It may not be the national debt. It may be the national physical condition. It may be mental health. It may be how we feel and how we act as human beings that what we have to worry about the most. Thank you.
Gentlelady is recognized.
So there's a myth that over 90% of schools report that they are successfully meeting the updated nutrition standards. USDA and my colleagues continue to tout that 90% of schools are successfully meeting these standards. But most of my schools are part of the 90%, and I'm hearing from concerns from schools that are in compliance, but things are not going as well as USDA would like you to believe. USDA has no data to show that 90% of schools are successfully meeting standards. Schools were not asked to report on how the standards have impacted student participation, cost, revenues, and food waste. Even if 90% of schools are in compliance, 50%, that's half of schools, are experiencing decreased revenue. USDA has been clear that every school must implement the new standards. Once they're certified, schools receive 6 cents per lunch reimbursement. There is no additional funding for schools complying with the breakfast standards that will be in effect for the 2014-2015 school year. Additionally, schools anticipate a further loss in revenue from the changes in the competitive foods rule, which is also going into effect for the 2014-2015 school year. It is completely disingenuous to imply that just because 90% of schools are meeting a standard they are forced to comply with means they are doing it successfully. And as a side note, I am a mother as well, and I have the opportunity to go eat lunch with my daughter at her school, and she gets to pick a couple of friends to come eat outside with us, and I watch these children throw away full plates of food because of all the reasons that have already been stated. If my colleagues truly believe 90% of schools are successful, then you shouldn't be concerned with this provision that an overwhelming percent of successful schools wouldn't qualify for. Unless you agree with me that there are really challenges in schools need more time and flexibility. I don't consider it a success when some schools can't balance their books and the students aren't eating the food. And again, I have personal testimony to seeing these children throw it away. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Ms. McCollum.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think it's interesting that we're having an argument on what the 90% or 93% of schools who are complying with this, because the lunch standards have been in place for nearly 2 years. 2 years. What we're really talking about is the breakfast standards are phasing in. So let's put the apples in the apple bin and the oranges in the oranges bin. We're talking about the breakfast that's phasing in. The lunch standards have been there for 2 years. And are there challenges? Yes, there are. And as people are talking about lunch ladies, in full disclosure, my sister's one of them at St. Paul's Schools. And so I'm there quite often, and I know the challenges that they face.
And I know that there's a lot of work to do. There's a lot of work to do in our communities. There's a lot of work to do with our families. There's a lot of work to do in the schools. But we are making progress. So if what this waiver is addressing is rolling back something that has been implemented and working and moving forward for 2 years with the lunch standards, then we are in fact going backwards. So my question to the chairman, if it is the concerns with phasing in the breakfast standards being phased in, does your waiver only apply to those schools who are having challenges phasing in the breakfast waivers because the lunch has been in place for 2 years? So does this waive the whole program, including what's been in for 2 years, or is this only addressing school districts that are having challenges with the new phase-in with the breakfast? I'm asking the chairman, does the waiver undo what's been going on for 2 years with the lunch standards? Is it only addressing the breakfast standards?
It doesn't undo anything. It just allows a waiver for the schools that are having to have 12 months to work on it.
So thank you, Mr. Chairman. So what it does is it goes back and it undoes 2 years' worth of lunch standards that the school districts have been working to comply on. That some of our school districts have made really tough choices in how they allocate their property
Would the
dollars.
gentlelady yield?
I will yield.
I just want to say it doesn't undo anything. It just allows a waiver.
Thank you. It allows a waiver for schools to verify net operating losses from a food service program for 6 months. Folks, I don't see the transparency in here that we aren't undoing, that we are not undoing by allowing this broad sweep of waivers to undo 2 years worth of lunch programming because the breakfast issue is phasing in. We do need flexibility. I was with Secretary Vilsack and Senator Franken in Minnesota, where he listened, where we've had great successes in St. Paul schools, but we continue to have great challenges in having equipment, in having farm to school and other things like that. There's work to be done, but let's show our children we're not afraid of doing the hard work. And we're not afraid of being consistent with what they hear from their parents, their grandparents, their aunts and uncles at home about eating healthy, that we reflect that in our schools where they should be educational beacons on how to become healthier. So I support the waiver because if the breakfast phase-in is the challenge, that it's too much for schools too fast, then let's focus on breakfast. But this waiver allows a broad sweeping exemption, so I support the
Would the lady yield just 1 second?
I'm sorry. I would be happy to do that, even though if the chairman's okay, because I said I was yielding back. Mr. Chair, it's
Gentlelady has
call.
time.
Thank you.
Just want to say that, as I mentioned before, if your school system is working, it has a problem, this doesn't even apply to them. So they won't even apply for this waiver. So those schools that you're talking about in your district.
Reclaiming my time then to have the last word on this. This doesn't say if it's been working. This says that a school authority in any state can verify a net loss from operating food service programs. Folks, this is wide open. If I was a school district and I wanted to figure out a way to save money, this, for whatever reason, and not comply, you could drive a food truck through this amendment. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Dent?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I certainly appreciate what the First Lady is trying to do with respect to healthy children and healthy foods that are served at the schools. I agree with her on that. But what the chairman of this committee is trying to, chairman of the subcommittee is trying to do is provide for a reasonable waiver. We have all heard from our school nutrition professionals on this issue. There are some there are some problems with this in terms of the implementation of the law. But I also can't help to note the irony. You know, on a regular basis, this administration routinely delays, exempts, waives various provisions of the health care law, and nary a peep. But to ask legislatively, they do that administratively. Here we're talking about legislatively providing for a waiver, quite reasonable. This is being treated as if it's some kind of a human rights violation. It's not. This is reasonable. And I think we should support the chairman's mark on this, and I think we should try to work to make sure these children are being served.
Will the gentleman yield for a question?
Sure.
Thank you. Would the gentleman acknowledge that the waivers, which aren't waivers that you just referred to in the Affordable Care Act, are delays, rather than what we have here, which is an actual waiver which exempts school districts who operate at a net loss from being required to comply with the standards. A delay would be something that I think we should work on. If there's a net loss and a...
Will the gentlelady yield? This is a delay.
I will yield my time to the chairman.
Okay, then I would ask the chairman, because the language as I read it is not a delay. The language as I read it allows a school district to apply to the secretary for a waiver, which is a full exemption, not requiring them to comply with the standards at all. It is not a delay that requires them, that gives them just a little bit more time to be in full compliance. Is that right?
Let us pull that language.
Can I just, reclaiming my time, might I say this?
That's the crux of the debate here.
Might I just say, reclaiming my time, that I believe that this waiver allows for a one-year delay. That's what this, what's in the bill. That's my understanding of the bill. And so again, I'm pretty much doing what I wanted to say, except that I see administrative delays on the health care law all the time, and waivers and exemptions, because the law is providing hardships on many individuals and small businesses. But here we're talking about, I think, a reasonable waiver that provides for a one-year delay, completely reasonable, going to be legislated, and it's the right thing to do. I yield back.
Can I?
Mr. DeLauro.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I just would address the issue of the waiver. What the bill would do and what it would waive.
Mike.
What the bill would do and what it would waive, thank you, are all of the new school meal standards. Calories, fat, saturated fat, trans fats, in addition to the ones that the interest groups are complaining about. The fruit and vegetable requirement, whole grains, and sodium. So the legislation, as has been said, is very broad. It's sweeping. If their concerns were limited to the certain issues, the bill would not go backward, which is what it does, on the fundamental nutrition limits on calories and fats, but in fact, it does. I'm obviously rising in support of Mr. Farr's amendment, but to address another issue, which is about revenue. I suggest that folks go back to take a look at school budgets. Oftentimes, what we find is that there is a rating of the food budget because schools find themselves short and demand resources in other areas. So they take from that food budget to take care of other demands. As it applies to the School Nutrition Association, we've had 19 of the past presidents say, do not move in this direction of a waiver. As a matter of fact, the woman who is the current head of the SNA, who wrote, this is interesting, in 2012 she said at Hickman Mills C1, which is the school that she was at in Kansas City, she says, this is a good thing. We had an idea that changes were coming. So we gradually began the transition so it would not be such a shock to the students when it was fully implemented. We've been working toward this goal. We have switched to romaine lettuce, broccoli, spinach, sweet potatoes. Spinach is quickly becoming a very, very popular vegetable. She likes the changes, she said. Every student in the district can eat healthier. Encourage your child or children to try new foods at home and at school, she said. And feel free to join your child at school for lunch or breakfast at any time. The fact is that this is a program that is working. We talk about 90%. We don't get 90% of almost anything in this institution that is successful. USDA said that they will keep listening, providing the help and the flexibility that the schools need. They've said that already, to make the healthy choices. In addition to which, there's been over $160 million spent by USDA for kitchen equipment so that schools, in fact, can prepare healthier and more nutritious meals. Why do we want to just ignore science standards? My colleagues on the other side of the aisle are always talking about science-based data. The Institute of Medicine has put together these standards. Again, over 90% of our schools are dealing with these issues.
and putting them into practice. I spent 4 days with my grandchildren over this weekend, 4 days. And if they could have had pizza and French fries at every meal and ended it with some chocolate, that's what they would have done for 4 days. And they say grandparents do indulge their grandchildren, and I can be, I do that. However, I have a responsibility to make sure that they are eating properly. What we want to do is to make sure, and that's what we have been struggling to do. And I want to just read quickly to you what Moms Rising wrote to me. Dear Rep. DeLauro, thousands of moms across the country have written to urge you to protect healthy school meals. Moms celebrated as the U.S. Department of Agriculture updated nutrition standards for school lunches for the first time in 15 years, ensuring that students eat more fruits, vegetables, and whole grains, avoid sugary snacks and foods that are high in fat or sodium. The vast majority of schools are already meeting the standards and serving healthy choices to the 31 million students who eat school meals every day. We urge you to protect our children's health, fight pediatric obesity by maintaining strong nutrition standards for school foods. Moms Rising, millions of mothers around this nation. We've got the PTA, you have United Fresh, we have the science that is driving this issue. Why would the Congress decide to interfere in this process? It's wrong, and it really violates our responsibility to our children. Thank you.
Mr. Cole.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I certainly don't pretend to be an expert on this subject, and I must say if my vices stopped at French fries and chocolate, I'd be a lot better off and a lot healthier than I am. My vices are fairly well known on this committee. But, I think if we listen to the debate, it should sober things up a little bit, because I think it's exactly why a lot of the country resents Washington, D.C. Look, I don't doubt anybody's intentions here, but there's sort of a subtext to me that we don't trust local people to make local decisions and look after their own kids. I don't think administrators want to do things to hurt kids. I don't think teachers want to. I don't think people that are operating cafeterias and school support personnel want to. I think what the chairman's asking for is reasonable delay, and I know the chairman's always willing to work with people in cases where local people decide they need to do that. I think what folks out in the country resent is we act as if all virtue and all wisdom is somehow concentrated in Washington, D.C. It's not. There is a lot of virtue and wisdom here. That's fine. But we don't have to control every single thing. I didn't run for Congress so I could be on the school board. And I actually trust the people in my local schools to actually make the right decisions. And they're actually usually on the school boards because they really care about those kids. And people that are administering local schools usually spent their whole life doing something that they made less money at than they might have made doing something else, because they care about kids and about education. So I would just suggest let's have a little bit more faith in our fellow Americans and give them the flexibility to make some local decisions that they think are the appropriate things to do. And guess what? If they make a mistake, I'll guarantee you they'll correct the mistake. Or people will be elected to the school board, or administrators will be fired, so that'll be changed. We don't have to control everything from
Would the gentleman yield for the purposes of...
I'm finished with my statement, but I'm always happy to yield to my friend.
Thank you. Just for the purposes of me being able to ask the chairman a clarifying question.
So I yield time to the chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, in some of the private discussion we just had, I just want to make sure what the majority's intention, get clarity on the majority's intention, because clearly you want to make sure that we have an opportunity for success. If we all do share the goal of making sure that our school meals are more nutritious, then making sure, I think we would not have had this long of a debate, I think, at least for most of us, if there was certainty that the language, the intent of the language in the bill is simply to give an only 1-year delay if a school district is able to show that they have at least a 6-month net operating at a 6-month net loss in their school lunch program, and give them only a 1-year delay to be able to address that concern and some of the concerns that are described in the report. if that is the intent, would you work with us on language and the ranking member on language to very specifically in the bill make sure that that's clear? Because I don't believe it is clear now.
Absolutely. That is our intent, and I will be happy to work with you to make sure that we get that language. If there's any ambiguity, we will put that in here.
Thank you.
And yes, that's
And
why
one follow-up question.
Because it's just the waiver.
So it is not the majority's intention to undercut these requirements, to leave an open-ended period of time for which school districts would no longer be required to comply.
On page 79, I mean, it states through for the 2014-15 school year. But again, if we need to tighten that language to make it clear, we're happy to work with you.
So the majority does not intend to eliminate these nutrition standards and allow school districts to remain out of compliance.
Not in this bill. I mean, I can say there are movements out there that would like to change it, but this does not do that.
Right. But in this bill, in this committee,
right,
the majority's intent is that the standards would remain in place. We would give some more flexibility for one single school year if a school district could prove that they had been operating at a net loss for 6 months.
Correct.
Okay. If we could tighten the language to make that clear, it would make some of us a lot more comfortable.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm glad I cleared that up.
Ms. Lowy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think we need some greater clarification with great respect for my friends. Let me just say, talking about being a grandmother, I took some grandkids down to Disney World not too long ago, and there must have been 50 wheelchairs. I hate to say most of them were women. And I went over to the manager, as I did, and I said, "Isn't this so nice of you? What organization are you hosting?" And he kind of laughed at me and said, "These people are in wheelchairs because they're too heavy," he said fat, "too heavy or fat to walk." We know there's an obesity epidemic in this country. And Mr. Chairman, with great respect, it was referred by some of my colleagues, my friend, the big hand of government. Somehow, I would like to call it the helpful hand of government, because I think these requirements here are so essential. So rather than giving waivers, maybe we should arrange for some technical assistance to reach out to these groups, these school lunch programs, and help them be more creative. I mentioned before a program which I funded when I was working at the state level. It doesn't make sense to me to negate the important requirements in this piece of legislation. If you want to provide some technical assistance to help these school people who are the ladies are doing their best to do a good job, but I don't think that the language that's currently in there makes any sense, and I have to work with you. And the reason I think it's so essential, because I feel passionately that Congress should not retreat from much-needed reforms to make school lunch and breakfast healthier by allowing some schools to opt out of the higher standards. And it shouldn't be a surprise to any of us who work with kids or our own kids that some kids don't like vegetables. So this challenge, and it's a challenge, shouldn't stand in our way of addressing the obesity epidemic that is affecting children across the country. And if you look at the numbers, according to the CDC, more than 1/3 of children are more likely to become obese adults and develop serious diseases like cancer. The bottom line is that 90% of school districts are already compliant, according to the Department of Agriculture, and we're working to help the 10% meet the higher standards. Now, one other point. Just last week, the department announced additional flexibilities for schools facing challenges complying with the law. The department has also granted numerous other flexibilities to stakeholders and will continue to do so in order for the standards to be workable throughout the country. So, I do believe the chairman is rightfully concerned that some districts are struggling, but the solution isn't to pull the department's focus away from helping these districts by granting waivers. Rather, the solution is to help them meet this higher standard by providing the technical assistance and training they need to become compliant. So, Mr. Chairman, I would like to work with you, with the ranking member and my colleagues who feel passionately about this issue, is not to give them a waiver, not to delay the implementation, but what kind of technical assistance can we provide so we can help these good people, as you said, the good ladies who are cooking and would like to provide these kids with the best food possible. How can we help them make the vegetables, make the fruits? One of my grandkids, I've ate, one of them loves broccoli, so her mother must be doing something right. I'd love to work with you on that, but I think to allow school districts to opt out of this does not make any sense, and it's not a good plan for us in the Congress. Thank you.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just want to add a few comments here. We have never before in human history seen children have adult onset diabetes. We have seen 1,000% increase in type 2 diabetes in the last 2 decades. 1,000% increase. 15 years ago, 3% of new cases of childhood diabetes were type 2. And now it's 50% are type 2 diabetes. This, as Mr. Serrano said, this is an epidemic that we all have to deal with, and we better wake up. And with all due respect to the chairman of the committee, for us in 2014 to be talking about having a salt shaker on a child's schoolhouse lunch table it's out of step with the direction that we need to go in. These kids are sick, and they're going to be sicker. And we have talks about Medicaid and long-term spending and how we're going to bend the cost curve, and we're going to have all these kids that have diabetes. Half of the country in the next 10 years is going to have either diabetes or pre-diabetes. We can talk until we're blue in the face about balancing the budget, but you're never going to bend the cost curve in Medicare. You're never going to bend the cost curve in the Medicaid program if we don't get the diabetes problem under control in the United States of America. 50% increase in strokes for children. Strokes. That was unheard of so many years ago until the food industry came in and they add salt, they add sugar, they add fat to our foods. It's a problem. And I want to make one last comment, because the gentlelady said 31% increase in fruits and vegetables, and that's a real issue. It's expensive. The 800-pound elephant in the middle of the room is we just passed a farm bill that subsidizes all of the bad food that they're putting in the school that's so cheap. It's not BS. We subsidize corn, wheat, high fructose corn syrup. It ends up in those Fritos that you were eating a little bit earlier, Mr. Simpson. And the reality, I saw you. I got my eye on you. That one. And those 3 empty bags that are at your feet, too. I'll always yield to my friend. All right. You got it. But it's true. Our taxpayers have subsidized these products for decades. And now we've got a real problem on our hands. We subsidize bad food, and then we subsidize the health care to take care of the people who got the bad food. And you want to know why people in middle America think we're out of our minds, that's why. And I think if we want to talk about Medicaid and Medicare and cost overruns and the health care or balancing the budget the next couple decades, this diabetes epidemic, I am telling you, is the problem that we need to address. And so we've got to see all these issues as interconnected. And if we see them as interconnected, then we can start solving them. A little bit of money up front in the school programs, can save us a lot of money in the long run. And I don't know if I have any time left, Mr. Chairman. Do I have any? I'd like to yield whatever remaining time I have left to the Italian grandmother who spoils her grandchildren.
The heavy hand of government has been...
Gentleman needs to remain standing.
Has been mentioned. I just think it's important to note about the leadership of the Food and Nutrition Service. They come straight from state and local government. Jane Thornton, Deputy Undersecretary, spent 25 years at local level, was a food service director, past president of the SNA. Kevin Concanon, Undersecretary, HHS Commissioner in 3 states, oversaw the implementation and operation of nutrition programs. Audrey Rowe did this in the state of Connecticut. And Secretary Vilsack was a governor at the state. They understand what it means to implement programs. They understand it, they get it, and they are providing that technical assistance that my colleague, Mrs. Lowy, talked about. They have been working with the schools, want to continue to listen and do this for that 10%, whatever those numbers of schools are, that having a difficult time with this. We do not have to waive the regulations in order to be able to get these schools up to par, making sure that there's healthy food at the school lunch program and the school breakfast program.
Mr. Frelinghuysen.
I'd like to yield time to Mr. Adderholt.
Gentleman's recognized.
I know a lot has been said, and we could probably go for the rest of the afternoon on this, but let me just say in closing, the waiver that is in this bill will only last through the 2014-15 school year. It's not permanent. We're not changing the standards. We are not trying to, I do think that Ms. Obama is well-intentioned, and I don't mean to be disrespectful to her program. I think it's just what is happening in this. I'm not sure that she realizes the full impact in greater America. And so what I would like to do is work with the gentlelady from Florida and to clarify this, and if there's anything in my bill that has any ambiguity, we will be glad to work with you on this, because that is our intention, and it's to not be permanent.
Mr. Farr is recognized to close.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. We've now spent an hour and 40 minutes on one issue, on one section of this bill. That's the longest debate I think we've had on any subject matter this year. This section is a poison pen for this bill. It's going to require the Democrats to vote no on it in this committee. It's going to go to the floor, and all kinds of procedural stuff will be done. It'll tie up the whole appropriations bill. And the problem is not with the intent of the author, it's the way it was written. It is mandatory. The Secretary shall establish a process by which a state shall grant. There's no permissiveness in this. That grant of waiver is to any school authority. Now, I agree with Mr. Cole that the politics of this ought to be at the local level. There's no provision in here that parents can opt out, as they can in school instruction programs, like sex education, and NETIS goes home to the parent and say, do you want your child to have this or not? There's no school board authority that it has to take a role in this. This is purely a food business notifying the Department of Education. It's a poison. Adopt my amendment, and let's work on something to correct it right. Thank you.
The question is on the Farr amendment. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed will say no. No. The noes have it. The amendment is...
Ask for an aye vote.
Roll call is requested.
Roll call vote.
And is granted. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Adderholt? No. Mr. Adderholt, no. Mr. Amadei? Mr. Amadei, no. Mr. Bishop? Yes. Mr. Bishop, aye. Mr. Calvert? No. Mr. Calvert, no. Mr. Carter? No. Mr. Carter, no. Mr. Cole? Mr. Cole, no. Mr. Crenshaw? Mr. Crenshaw, no. Mr. Cuellar? Mr. Cuellar, aye. Mr. Culberson? Mr. Culberson, no. Ms. DeLauro? Aye. Ms. DeLauro, aye. Mr. Dent? No. Mr. Dent, no. Mr. Diaz-Balart? Mr. Diaz-Balart, no. Mr. Farr?
Aye.
Mr. Farr, aye. Mr. Fatah? Aye. Mr. Fatah, aye. Mr. Fleischman? No. Mr. Fleischman, no. Mr. Fortenberry? No. Mr. Fortenberry, no. Mr. Frelinghuysen? No. Mr. Frelinghuysen, no. Ms. Granger? Ms. Granger, no. Mr. Graves? Dr. Harris? Dr. Harris, no. Ms. Herrera-Butler? Ms. Herrera-Butler, no. Mr. Honda? Mr. Honda, aye. Mr. Joyce? Mr. Joyce, no. Ms. Capter?
Aye.
Ms. Capter, aye. Mr. Kingston? Mr. Kingston, no. Mr. Latham? Mr. Latham, no. Ms. Lee? Ms. Lee, aye. Mrs. Lowy?
Aye.
Mrs. Lowy, aye. Ms. McCollum? Ms. McCollum, aye. Mr. Moran? Mr. Moran, aye. Mr. Nunnally? Mr. Nunnally, no. Mr. Owens? Mr. Owens, aye. Mr. Pastor? Mr. Pastor, aye. Ms. Pingree? Ms. Pingree, aye. Mr. Price? Mr. Price, aye. Mr. Quigley? Mr. Quigley, aye. Mrs. Roby? Mrs. Roby, no. Mr. Rogers? Mr. Rogers, no. Mr. Rooney? Mr. Rooney, no. Ms. Robo-Allard? Ms. Robo-Allard, aye. Mr. Ryan? Mr. Ryan, aye. Mr. Schiff? Mr. Schiff, aye. Mr. Serrano? Mr. Simpson? Mr. Simpson, no. Mr. Stewart? Mr. Stewart, no. Mr. Valadeo? Mr. Valadeo, no. Mr. Visclosky? Mr. Visclosky, aye. Ms. Wasserman Schultz? Ms. Wasserman Schultz, aye. Mr. Wolf? Mr. Wolf, no. Mr. Womack? Mr. Womack, no. Mr. Yoder? Mr. Yoder, no.
Other members who wish to be recorded? Mr. Graves.
Mr. Graves, no.
Do members wish to change votes? Clerk will tally. While the clerk is tallying, let me remind you, the gentleman wish to be recorded. Mr. Serrano.
Mr. Serrano, aye.
While the clerk is tallying, remind you again that the Commerce Justice Bill on the floor will resume on the floor around 1 or 1:30. What? 12:30. I'm informed it's 12:30. So, we cannot, of course, proceed in this chamber while we're busy on the floor. So, I urge you to be as brief in your remarks as you can. Mr. Dent.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Hold on. On this vote, the yeas are 22, the nays are 29. The amendment is not agreed to. Mr. Dent.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will read.
Amendment offered by Mr. Dent. At the end of the bill, before the short title,
Without objection, the reading is dispensed with. The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. After hearing my friend Mr. Ryan's comments, which I totally agree with, against subsidizing unhealthy foods, I offer this amendment along with my friend Mr. Moran in that spirit. This limitation amendment seeks to impose revenue limits on the USDA's sugar program. And by the way, this is a limitation amendment. And let me be clear, this proposal does not end the current sugar program. What it will do is restrict the program to small sugar processors. This proposal simply refuses to provide benefits to entities with more than $300 million in annual revenue. That's a third of $1 billion. So these are the big operations. Sugar is the only commodity that was not reformed in the 2014 Farm Bill. The only one. Last year, sugar processors claimed their program operated at, quote, no net cost. However, within weeks of barely surviving votes to reform the sugar program in the House, the industry began forfeiting on their non-recourse loans at a cost of $258 million to the taxpayers. All the time they were telling us that there was no cost to the sugar program. They knew that the forfeitures were coming. They knew that taxpayers would be left holding the bag after the sugar program distorted the marketplace for 5 straight years. Now they're blaming Mexico for their problems. They say that if we just keep Mexico from exporting the United States, everything will be okay. Forget about the fact that the U.S. share of the sugar market was expanding and that the U.S. had expanded production in recent years. So just blame Mexico. That's the new mantra. The problem with the sugar program is the sugar program. It's in desperate need of reform, but we can't write a new farm bill here, and I understand that. What we can do is limit the risk faced by taxpayers. This amendment prohibits any entity making revenue from sugar of over $300 million, that's a third of $1 billion, from having access to the sugar loan program. It does not impact small processors, only those big enough to stand on their own without federal assistance. You know, the sugar program is destroying a lot of manufacturing jobs in this country. It fleeces the taxpayers and represents corporate welfare of the worst kind. You know, to my conservative Republican friends, I say, protect the taxpayer interest on this. It's time we do this. And to my progressive friends on the other side of the aisle, I say, let's stop this corporate welfare. It's excessive, it's unnecessary, and as Mr. Ryans pointed out, we're subsidizing a lot of folks. We're subsidizing sugar unnecessarily, and I think this is the right thing to do. And I should also point out, too, there were various limitation amendments of this that were passed by the House, limiting payments to growers in the Farm Bill, only to have the Farm Bill conferees strip it out. Both chambers passed some limitations. Sugar somehow managed to escape all this. So I'm asking us to do the right thing to protect the taxpayers, stop the corporate welfare, protect manufacturing jobs in this country, and do the right thing. So again, I respectfully ask for your support.
Chairman Adderholt.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I respectfully rise to oppose my friend's amendment. I understand the pros and cons of the sugar policy. The Agriculture Appropriation Bill is not the appropriate place for us to move forward with this in this debate. Sugar policy was settled in the Farm Bill, which we adopted in just a few months ago. So therefore, like I said, I hate to oppose my good friend, but we just not this appropriate venue today to debate this issue.
Would the gentleman from Georgia hold up the box? He is opening at the moment.
Oh.
Mr. Farr.
Yes, the thinnest kid in the class to stand up with a box of candy. That's Mr. Chairman, this is a traditional debate. Essentially, America has farmers on the ground growing sugar beets and sugar cane, and on the other side are the purchasers of that, which are the candy industry. And I respect very much Mr. Dent. He's a great gentleman, a great warrior for Hershey chocolate that he represents, but this bill really does access to loan guarantees. It doesn't deny payments to these farmers. It's access to loan guarantees. I think you begin this dangerous slope. It's a policy issue that ought to be worked out in the Farm Bill, not in the Appropriations Bill. Oppose the amendment.
Mr. Rooney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise in opposition to the amendment as well. With all due respect to my friend from Pennsylvania, I think it's a little disingenuous to talk about the evils of sugar when the real purpose of this amendment is to benefit big candy. And I love Hershey bars as much as anybody. In fact, we have our family reunion at Hershey Park, sweetest place on earth. But, and it may be nefarious for me to stand here and advocate for sugar when I represent a lot of sugarcane growers, just as you represent candy makers. But let's take all that aside and deal with the facts. And that is that the U.S. Sugar Loan Program has been repaid every year from 2002 to 2012. Last year, yeah, there was problems because Mexico did dump a bunch of sugar. And to my friend from Youngstown, it's the same thing we saw in western PA and eastern Ohio when steel was dumped in this country. What are we to do? Are we to allow for the sugar prices to get so low that wipes out our industry here in this country, that we import maybe candy prices, maybe candy can profit a little bit more, but are the candy manufacturers really going to discount the price of a candy bar because they're going to get a little bit cheaper of a candy bar or sugar prices?
Would the gentleman yield?
In a second. The fact of the matter is that we can compete with any sugar growers in the world. We can't compete with their governments. So if we don't have these loan programs, our sugar cane growers and sugar beet growers are not going to be able to compete with other governments' treasuries. So I'm happy to yield.
You just mentioned that when the price of sugar drops, you're concerned about that price dropping. When it does drop below a certain level, the federal government buys that excess sugar and then sells it at a loss to the ethanol producers. So the current program currently does protect sugar growers in the case the price drops. That's the problem here. And I just wanted to point that out for the record. And by the way, when you buy one of those Hershey bars, the money goes into a trust It educates a bunch of kids. That's another story. I just want
Great.
you to know that. It's owned by a trust.
Then I'm
So-
educating a lot of kids. I'll take my time back and yield back. Thank you.
Mr. Moran.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I rise in support of this amendment. I'm glad that the donuts are passing me by as I'm speaking. That's the Iowa State University study that was recently conducted found that this sugar policy is costing American consumers about $3.5 billion a year due to added costs spread over the entire food supply. So it's essentially a hidden tax on food. Policies that keep U.S. sugar prices higher than prices on the world market encourage food manufacturing jobs to go overseas. And that's exactly what we've seen happen. Over the last several years, about 127,000 jobs were lost in segments of the food and beverage industries that use sugar in making their products. Now, it's the small and mid-sized companies, they're often family-owned, that just can't compete. And they're the ones that are being forced out of business by cheaper imports. The U.S. Department of Commerce estimates every sugar production job, and we understand people that represent districts that produce sugar want to protect those jobs, but for every one of those jobs that is protected, this sugar subsidy eliminated 3 jobs in food manufacturing. So if we're talking about American jobs, you know, a 3-to-1 ratio is pretty convincing. And this amendment doesn't end the sugar program. It just refuses to provide benefits to entities that with more than $300 million in annual revenue. So only talking about the big guys. More than $300 million in annual revenue are the only ones that would be affected by this amendment. It targets, as a result, the program to smaller processors. It provides government support to those that need it most. It's the same logic that the Farm Bill applied to corn, wheat, and soybean farmers who can't receive benefits if your income exceeds a certain level. The large sugar processors are capable of standing on their own without federal assistance, and that's why I'd urge support for Mr. Dent's amendment. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise in support of Mr. Dent, Mr. Moran's amendment. As you all know, I represent the 3rd District of Tennessee. There are some candy manufacturers, Little Debbie's. As a fiscal conservative, I think the reform or the escape of reforms in the sugar issue from the Farm Bill just escapes me. It's shocking. But it's a jobs issue. It's a jobs issue in the 3rd District. Other countries, Canada, Mexico, are making a play for our businesses. And I think it's a common sense reform to the program. It's fair. As Mr. Dent has alluded to, it restricts the program, and I would urge its amendment. I thank you.
Ms. McCollum.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm speaking in opposition to the Dent Moran amendment. Many of you have heard me speak to this before. I'm not just a Democrat. I'm a member of the Democratic Farmer Labor Party. And in my state, sugar beet production is #1. And that means my state's rural economy will take a direct hit because of this amendment. This amendment hurts farmers. It hurts small businesses. It hurts hospitals, and it hurts schools. It hurts the real lives of people in rural communities when the sugar beet processors collapse. The property tax values collapse in those parts of my rural state as well. By denying the benefit of the U.S. Sugar beet processors, most of which are farmer-owned cooperatives, this amendment directly denies the benefit to the loan guarantee of all sugar farmers. Why? Because forcing even one sugar producer to sell at a dumped market price would force all producers to sell at the dumped market price, or at being risked at being undercut in the market. This amendment would deny all American sugar beet and cane farmers the very basic low-level support that the Farm Bill safety net is designed to provide. Sugar producers receive no government payments and benefits only from the Loan Sugar Policy Program that's designed to provide. From 2002 to 2012, sugar producers repaid all government loans. I repeat, they repaid all government loans with interest at zero cost to the American taxpayers. This amendment threatens the ability of sugar producers to take out or repay their loans. Folks, American-grown sugar creates more than 142,000 jobs in 20 states and in nearly $20 billion in annual economic activity. This amendment sends a message that this House wants to shut down sugar production, which will shut down here jobs at home, right after Congress has just passed a farm bill. I urge my colleagues to join me in opposing this amendment to recognize that Mexico dumped sugar into this country and undercut the price by 50% in 1 year alone. Folks, I urge you to join with me in opposing this amendment. Stand with sugar beet farmers in Minnesota and sugar farmers all across the United States. Protect 142,000 jobs in 20 states here in the United States. And with that, I yield back.
Ms. Kaptur.
Yes, a great deal has been said on this amendment already. I rise in opposition to Mr. Dent's well-intentioned amendment. You come from a state and a place that manufactures products, and obviously sugar is one of those ingredients. I come from a region where we produce those ingredients, and we have experienced what it's like to have dumped sugar come into this country from places where people can't own the land where that sugar is produced. They're sweat labor. They have no rights. The farmers here are asked to compete against a different economic system, not just a company or some farm abroad, but rather an economic system that disadvantages them. I don't think Mr. Moran and I will ever agree on an economic issue. We agree on some defense issues. But we really have to take positions that strengthen the macroeconomy of this country, not for any one company or any one set of interests, but rather so that our country can stand on its own 2 feet, including in the food sector. Sugar is one of the important ingredients in many of the products, and it is part of the fundamental spine of Louisiana, of Florida, of Ohio, and Michigan, and Minnesota, and the Dakotas. It isn't something small. It's very much a part of a system of production where our farmers can own their land, and if in fact they hire farm workers, those individuals work under contract, that they have rights. And we are fighting for that economic system. It goes beyond the product. It goes to the very core of how we function as an economy in this country. I remember we have a Pioneer Sugar beet processing facility in our general region of Ohio. Michigan and Ohio cooperate together. And I remember Chet Mock, this wonderful, wonderful, wonderful farmer from Ohio who eventually passed, but how hard he worked. Beet production is not easy. I'm not saying cane production is, but I watched him try to compete against dumped sugar. And it made me so angry. And I saw the farmers come together and create this company, Pioneer, where they now all process their beets together in order to try to compete in a world market that isn't always so friendly. This loan program, which, as Congresswoman McCollum has said, they paid their money back. I mean, we've experienced in the automotive sector a situation where we allowed dumped cars in this country to a point where we almost lost the automotive industry of the United States. I'm not for losing any major American industry, especially when they're competing against other economies, not companies. And that is the case with dumped sugar in every one of these instances. And so we have to stand up for this country and for the interests of our producers here. And thank God some of them are able to survive in the global markets that we face today. Many of the competitors coming from places that are undemocratic without a rule of law. And so I oppose the gentleman's amendment. I do buy the products that the companies in your district produce, so I think I'm doing my part to try to help them compete. But please allow our farmers to compete on a very unlevel global playing field. I oppose the Dent amendment and support the U.S. sugar industry.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Simpson.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I rise in opposition to the Dent amendment. my good friend, Mr. Dent. I understand why Mr. Dent and Mr. Fleshman are supportive of this amendment. I have no idea why Mr. Moran is supportive of it, but and I'm glad to see that Mr. Ryan passed up the Dunkin' Donuts that just went by a few minutes ago. First of all, this amendment is misguided. It comes on the heels of just passing the Farm Bill and just starting the new Farm Bill. We debated this on the floor during the Farm Bill. You lost on the floor during the Farm Bill. This amendment is misguided because unlike most other commodities, sugar cane and sugar beets must be processed before the sugar can be sold or stored. Therefore, loans are made to the processor rather than to each individual farmer. The processor's total sales are not related to the size of the farmers who grow the crops and deliver cane or beets to the processor. That means this actually affects small farmers. It's not just those making over $300 million. It affects the small farmers that provide the beets and cane to those processors. But you know, I've never talked to a cane sugar producer or a beet sugar producer that hasn't told me they're willing to compete in a free market. You show me a free market and they're willing to compete. The reality is there is not a free market out there. Brazil subsidizes their sugar producers to the tune of about $2.5 billion a year. That's what we're competing against. In Mexico, the government owns about 20% of the sugar mills. And let me give you an indication of how this works. When I sat on the Ag Committee and we were debating the sugar program, which is a no-cost program to the taxpayer, it doesn't cost the federal government anything, there was some candy processors there. And they said, man, if we didn't do away with the sugar program, they were going to have to move to Mexico because they could compete in Mexico. Well, in front of me, I had the price of domestic sugar in Mexico, in the United States, and in Canada. Guess what? The price of domestic sugar in Mexico was more expensive than it was in the United States. In Canada, it was more expensive than it was in the United States. So I asked the manufacturer, well, you could be moving to Mexico for one reason or another, but it certainly isn't because of the price of sugar. And then he told me the true story. The Mexican government allowed him, or candy manufacturers, to move to Mexico to build a plant to buy sugar at the world dump price. At the world dump price. And manufacture candy. But guess what? They could only sell that candy outside of Mexico. They could not sell it inside Mexico to compete against their own sugar industry. That's how this works. There is not a free market out there. And all the candy manufacturers say, oh, we've got to reduce the price of sugar. I don't see the price of a Hershey's candy bar coming down. And believe me, I'm like a lot of other people here, like Mr. Rooney. I eat my share of them. And I'm supporting all of that education that you support also. But I understand why you're doing this. But it is a bad program. Let the Farm Bill that we have passed be implemented and let it work its way. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I'm afraid those watching at home this debate so far would be convinced that the three major food groups in this country are sugar, fat, and salt. So I don't know if it's a culturally in-depth program that we have to address or what, but it's a little distressing. I understand what people are saying on both sides. What's discouraging is everyone's trying to figure out why someone is voting simply because of their district. And I get that, right? Do they make candy bars? Well, they make candy bars in my district too. But in this extraordinarily difficult challenge to be consistent, those of us who fought in the Farm Bill to end subsidies that we thought were unnecessary and something of government welfare have to strive to be consistent. Let's ask ourselves, how many other products are subsidized by other countries? Are we now going to, with each one of those products, match what all those other countries are doing and get into an extraordinary economic trade war, for lack of a better term, on each one of those? And how much will that cost us? Because it's in some of those countries' interest to go all in on one or two products. Well, if you take the whole world into consideration, then we're involved with subsidizing almost every product we make and produce. So I respect the heartfelt beliefs of those who think that they need to subsidize here, but we've got to ask ourselves, is there a better way to address issues of countries dumping products or subsidizing products versus what we're doing. And are we any better with what we're doing? Are other countries going to look at this and say, well, sure, well, the U.S. has doubled down, let's go in for even more? At some point, it has to stop. We have to find a better way to do this, and I therefore support the Dent Amendment.
Mr. Dent is recognized to close.
Just real quick, sure, I represent Hershey, but I have a lot of other confectioners in my district. Premise Made, Josh Early, I have Godiva in one of the counties I represent. Mars is nearby. That's not the point. The bigger issue is I have a lot of farmers in my district. You know, Milton Hershey didn't put that company in Hershey, Pennsylvania because of the sugar. He put it there because of the milk. I have a lot of dairy producers who sell a lot of product to confectioners. I know my dairy folks are very supportive of what I'm doing. I have Ocean Spray in my district, cranberry processors, or a co-op. They need sugar to make the cranberry juice, something that we can drink. That's what this is about. People need to be able to buy sugar at a market price. We are, as Republicans, I think we should talk about a market-based price. That's all we're asking for. Stop the corporate welfare, stop the subsidies. This is a simple limitation amendment. If you have revenues greater than $1/3 billion, you don't need the government's help. Please support the amendment.
Question is on the Dent Amendment. All in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed say no.
No.
The noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to. Chairman Kingston, roll call is requested. Is there sufficient support? There is insufficient support. Chairman Kingston.
Chairman, I have an amendment.
Does he have enough? The gentleman will suspend. We do have enough to support a roll call. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Adderholt? No. Mr. Adderholt, no. Mr. Amadei? Yes. Mr. Amadei, aye. Mr. Bishop? No. Mr. Bishop, no. Mr. Calvert? No. Mr. Calvert, no. Mr. Carter? No. Mr. Carter, no. Mr. Cole? Mr. Crenshaw? No. Mr. Crenshaw, no. Mr. Cuellar? No. Mr. Cuellar, no. Mr. Culberson? No. Mr. Culberson, no. Ms. DeLauro? No. Ms. DeLauro, no. Mr. Dent? Aye. Mr. Dent, aye. Mr. Diaz-Balart? Mr. Diaz-Balart, no. Mr. Farr?
No.
Mr. Farr, no. Mr. Fatah? Mr. Fleischman? Aye. Mr. Fleischman, aye. Mr. Fortenberry? No. Mr. Fortenberry, no. Mr. Frelinghuysen? Aye. Mr. Frelinghuysen, aye. Ms. Granger? No. Ms. Granger, no. Mr. Graves? Mr. Graves, aye. Dr. Harris? Aye. Dr. Harris, aye. Ms. Herrera-Butler? No. Yes. Ms. Herrera-Butler, aye. Mr. Honda? No. Mr. Honda, no. Mr. Joyce? Mr. Joyce, aye. Ms. Capter? No. Ms. Capter, no. Mr. Kingston? Aye. Mr. Kingston, aye. Mr. Latham? Ms. Lee? Mrs. Lowy?
No.
Mrs. Lowy, no. Ms. McCullum? No. Ms. McCullum, no. Mr. Moran? Aye. Mr. Moran, aye. Mr. Nunnally? No. Mr. Nunnally, no. Mr. Owens? No. Mr. Owens, no. Mr. Pastor? No. Mr. Pastor, no. Ms. Pingree? No. Ms. Pingree, no. Mr. Price? No. Mr. Price, no. Mr. Quigley? Mr. Quigley, aye. Mrs. Roby? No. Mrs. Roby, no. Mr. Rogers? No. Mr. Rogers, no. Mr. Rooney? No. Mr. Rooney, no. Ms. Robo-Allard? No. Ms. Robo-Allard, no. Mr. Ryan? Aye. Mr. Ryan, aye. Mr. Schiff? Aye. Mr. Schiff, aye. Mr. Serrano? No. Mr. Serrano, no. Mr. Simpson? No. Mr. Simpson, no. Mr. Stewart? Yes. Mr. Stewart, aye. Mr. Valadeo? Mr. Valadeo, no. Mr. Visklosky? Mr. Visklosky, aye. Ms. Wasserman-Schultz? No. Ms. Wasserman-Schultz, no. Mr. Wolf? Aye. Mr. Wolf, aye. Mr. Womack? Aye. Mr. Womack, aye. Mr. Yoder? No. Mr. Yoder, no.
Are there members who wish to be recorded? Mr. Latham?
Mr. Latham is not recorded. Mr. Latham, no.
Ms. Lee?
Aye. Ms. Lee, aye.
Are there members who wish to change their vote? Clerk will tally. Mr. Cole?
Mr. Cole is not recorded.
Gentleman votes no.
Mr. Cole, no.
On this vote, the yeas are 18, the nays are 32. The amendment is not agreed to. Mr. Kingston.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will read.
Amendment offered by Mr. Kingston.
Without objection, the reading is dispensed with. The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In 2010, this committee and our subcommittee, of which I was chairing at the time, eliminated earmarks, and I actually have the list. Hundreds and hundreds of earmarks were eliminated. And as part of changing into a new system, we have asked the agricultural research facilities to do their own cost-benefit analysis on new projects based on need, based on the age of the buildings and so forth. And they came up with a list of 21 projects. And so what my amendment does is transfers money largely out of the rural water and waste disposal account. It's excess money that is not being used, and puts it to funding this list. And unfortunately, it's not enough money to go down the whole list, but I know Mr. Farr has one in Salinas that I have visited, and it was a 1950s building and 1940s building. But some of these facilities have fallen way behind modern science, and in order to keep up for food safety and disease and so forth, we need to be able to have the flexibility to do something. But this is simply transferring the money so that the ARS can comply with the President's request on these buildings. And I yield back.
Chairman Adderholt.
Oh, yes, Mr. Chairman, we would accept this amendment.
Mr. Farr.
Mr. Chairman, I support the amendment. What we did, we followed the military's protocol, where the military, all the services, prioritize what they need in their capital outlay projects. and it's put on a list, and that list matures based on priority needs. And we said, instead of this program being earmarked, and obviously the Senate always won, let's do it on merit. What are the buildings that really need it around the country? No politics involved. Just do it on merit. And the number one that comes up in the entire country is the facility, the chicken facility and research facility in Mr. Kingston's district. I think it's responsible that we follow this protocol, and we need to put some money back into the account so he wouldn't have to rob Peter to pay Paul. I worry about taking it from rural water and rural sewage, but I do support the idea that we're getting back on track and doing something responsible through this amendment, and I hope we'll follow through with the rest of the projects in years to come.
Mr. Bishop.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I, too, support this amendment. As a leading poultry disease research facility and a world-class training center for avian influenza and Newcastle disease virus diagnostics and vaccines, the USDA Southeast Poultry Research Laboratory provides sound, efficient, safe, reliable solutions to some of the world's most challenging issues facing the poultry industry. It conducts groundbreaking research on some of the deadliest and most economically devastating diseases, such as the highly pathogenic H5N1 avian influenza virus and other bird flus. And I think it's just good common sense for us to fully support this. It's economically necessary, and certainly the public health, safety, and welfare will benefit greatly from it. I think it's a very timely amendment, and I support it.
Chairman Kingston is recognized to close.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And the only thing I wanted to correct on my friend Mr. Farr is that it's actually not in my district. It is in Georgia, but not in my district. So, but with that, this is similar to the FIDA for the military construction account. It is generated by ARS, and it is in the President's request. Thank you.
It may soon be in your district.
Without objection.
On the Kingston amendment, all in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed say no. The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. Are there further amendments? Ms. Capter.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk, please.
Clerk will read.
Which one?
Strike section 730. Capter 1.
I've got two of those. Amendment offered by Ms. Capter, strike sections 730. relating to a limitation on funds to implement certain federal regulations with respect to requirements
The
regarding.
amendment be considered.
Without objection, the reading is dispensed with. Gentlelady recognized.
Yes, my amendment essentially is in opposition to the language in the base bill to Section 730. It strikes that. As written, Section 730 would prohibit the U.S. Department of Agriculture from finalizing regulations to address commonplace abuses and anti-competitive practices that bear down on family farmers and livestock producers, for example, in the poultry industry. My amendment is pro-farmer, it's pro-consumer, and it's pro-competition. Let me point out to the committee that our committee should not be in a position of trying to thwart the Farm Bill. I'm talking about the Farm Bill of 2008 as well as the current Farm Bill that was passed. Yes, I said 2008 because since that Farm Bill's passage, the U.S. Department of Agriculture has been following the law and proceeding methodically to hold hearings on what the Farm Bill directed it to do, on the competition that faces family farmers involved in livestock production. USDA, in following the bill, has proposed rules as of June 2010 incorporating listening through those hearings to what farmers were saying to them. Then in 2011, continuing to proceed based on the law, USDA issued final rules after receiving extensive public comments. Importantly, the rules that they are proposing include farmer protections such as fair contracting procedures for these family farmers. But instead of allowing USDA to do its job, the meat packers and the poultry companies did an end run again now to this Congress in this bill that would essentially say to USDA, you can't complete your work that you began over 6 years ago on practices that have been an issue for decades to address a serious situation and the unfair practices that impact farmers across our nation. Here's an example. I remember I was up in one part of our country, I won't say which state, a meeting with farmers who were subjected to what I term very unfair practices. And I said to the farmers, may I ask you a question? Because they were totally beholden to the poultry integrator. I said, who owns the manure? The black gold here in this operation. And the farmer looked at me and he just had no answer. 2 hours later, I was with the company that had sold the hens to the farmer, and I said, what happens to the black gold? And the company said to me, oh, let me show you. And the man, the head went back room, comes out with a jar, and he shows me pelletized manure. And he said, we own it. I said, do you have contract rights to that manure? And what was interesting was he knew all about the science of fertilizers and power production based on that very rich nutrient, but the farmer was left out in the lurch. We've been trying, as a country, to be fair to all parties in the food production process, the farmer as well as the processor. The amendment that I am proposing is supported by over 168 farmer, consumer, community, and faith organizations from around the country. They know the situation that they face every day. It includes the Alabama Contract Poultry Growers Association, groups like the Cattle Producers of Washington, Contract Poultry Association of Virginia, the Federation of Southern Cooperatives, Independent Beef Association, Iowa Farmers Union. The list is very long. Rural Vermont, all kinds of organizations support this because they know what is happening is not fair on both sides of the equation. The need for additional protections for farmers is even greater now because of the vertical integration going on in the food production system in our country, enabling contracting practices that are even more abusive for local farmers. The market power, for example, of the big chicken companies becomes much higher at the local level. An example, poultry companies source chicken from contract farmers within about a 50-mile range of the processing plant. Chickens don't travel very well, so they have to be close to where they're processed. But according to USDA, about half of the farmers have only 2 processing plants within 50 miles, and 1/4 of the farmers have only 1 plant. That means there's no competition in the industry. They are truly beholden. I would ask my colleagues to please level the playing field, let farmers have an opportunity to have their contractual rights and fair practices observed in the food production systems of this country. I would urge support of the Kaptur Amendment.
Chairman Adderholt.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The bill includes a provision that is not new to this committee and maintains restrictions on what rules can be promulgated, implemented, and enforced by the Grain Inspectors, Packers, and Stockyards Administration. It should be remembered that members of both parties and both bodies have come out in opposition to regulations originally proposed by GIPSA in June of 2010. The opposition stems from a belief that the agency reached beyond what the 2008 Farm Bill instructed. This language is nearly identical to the language included in the FY13 conference report, which also required USDA to rescind several provisions of the rule. USDA did not abide by the law, and so this provision again requires USDA to rescind several provisions of the rule. Therefore, based on that, I would ask my colleagues to oppose this amendment.
Mr. Womack.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. With all due respect to the gentlelady from Ohio, I too rise in opposition to the amendment. As a matter of fact, this committee, with bipartisan support, has supported the language in the base bill. And there's 3 points I'd like to make about the language in the amendment as opposed to the language in the base bill. And that is that the language in the base bill does nothing that destroys the protections that are afforded to farmers and ranchers in the Packers and Stockyards Act. Second, the language in the bill protects the tournament system. And for those unfamiliar with the tournament system and these marketing agreements that are put together, that are basically the backbone of the relationship between the producers and the packers, that people who go to the extreme degrees of producing a quality animal are rewarded for that work. If they produce a better quality animal, they are given a premium for that animal. Those that just do the minimum essential, the average performers, are going to be paid base rate. And those that don't do a very good job of producing a better quality animal, in fact produce an inferior animal, are provided a rate that is discounted. And that's just basic free enterprise. That's the backbone of these marketing agreements. So the language that the lady is suggesting in her amendment would not protect the tournament system. And then the third argument that I would make is that there is a well-established legal standard that has been affirmed by several appellate courts. And the base bill sees to it that GIPSA cannot, on a whim, go against a well-established standard. If GIPSA has its way, farmers and ranchers would not be required to show harm to competition, which seems to me to be a fair argument in basically making the argument from the producer's standpoint that they have been harmed. And if we take away this standard, then all we're going to do is open this thing up to frivolous lawsuits and essentially probably going to end the marketing agreements as we now know them. So for all of those 3 reasons, I have to rise in opposition to the gentlelady's amendment and associate my remarks with that of the chairman and urge defeat of the amendment. I yield back. Be happy to yield.
Is it not true that the base bill provisions on the district rules are inconsistent with existing law as passed by the authorizing within the Farm Bill?
I don't think that's an accurate statement, and all I can say is that this particular committee, time and time again, has worked in with bipartisan agreement to protect what is covered now in the base bill. Be happy to yield. And I think the House has been well established in its attempt in the authorizing language to address this particular issue. The fact that it may not have had a dance partner on the other side of the Capitol is a different example or a different issue altogether. But I think the House has been has established itself as having covered this. What's covered in this base bill has been the prevailing attitude of the House since I've been in Congress.
Didn't the House and the Senate both pass the conference committee on the Farm Bill, and didn't it become law?
Well, which is precisely why we are attempting to do what we're doing in the base bill of the Ag Appropriations. I yield back.
Ms. Capter is recognized to close. I'm sorry, Ms. Pingree.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to briefly rise in support of this. I couldn't be any more articulate than Representative Capter has already been this morning, and I know GIPSA is one of those things that's constantly debated. But frankly, I do not think that we should be letting the bill stand as it is. This is very common sense language. What she's proposing is very common sense. USDA should be providing basic protections for livestock and poultry farmers against these abusive and anti-competitive contracting practices. Her amendment will restore these protections, and I think we should be doing that and expressing support for hardworking families and ranchers who need our support in making sure that they can make an honest living in a competitive marketplace. I yield back the balance of my time unless Ms. Capter is interested in my time.
Ms. Capter is recognized to close.
I thank you very much, and I would just say that we shouldn't stop the Department of Agriculture from implementing the Farm Bill. Your provision does that in the base bill. I want to go back to regular order and not try to stop the authorization process and the rulemaking process at USDA. It's been going on long enough. And I would just, I hate to get personal about this, but Arkansas has companies like Tyson's and OK Foods, George's and Simmons. They have a very important role in the economies of those states. So should the farmers doing the work. And in Alabama, you have Tyson, Pilgrim's Pride, Koch Foods, Keystone, Kegels, and Wayne Farms. They have major market power. So should the farmers doing the hard sweat labor that produces these animals. So I'm saying let the Department of Agriculture go forward. Don't tie their hands by Section 730 in this bill. Let's support fair contracting processes. Let's support just practices. Let's remove abusive practices that are affecting those who become a modern form of indentured, bonded production houses to major integrators. We have to level the playing field, let USDA do its job, support the Capter Amendment, support our contract farmers.
Question is on the Capter Amendment. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, say no. No. The noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to.
Mr. Chairman, on that I'd like to ask for a recorded vote, please.
Recorded vote is requested and is granted. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Adderholt? No. Mr. Adderholt, no. Mr. Amadei? Mr. Amadei, no. Mr. Bishop? Yes. Mr. Bishop, aye. Mr. Calvert? No. Mr. Calvert, no. Mr. Carter? No. Mr. Carter, no. Mr. Cole? Mr. Cole, no. Mr. Crenshaw? No. Mr. Crenshaw, no. Mr. Cuellar? No. Mr. Cuellar, no. Mr. Culberson? No. Mr. Culberson, no. Ms. DeLauro? Aye. Ms. DeLauro, aye. Mr. Dent? No. Mr. Dent, no. Mr. Diaz-Balart? No. Mr. Diaz-Balart, no. Mr. Farr?
Aye.
Mr. Farr, aye. Mr. Fatah? Mr. Fleischman? No. Mr. Fleischman, no. Mr. Fortenberry? No. Mr. Fortenberry, no. Mr. Frelinghuysen? Mr. Frelinghuysen, no. Ms. Granger? No. Ms. Granger, no. Mr. Graves? Mr. Graves, no. Dr. Harris? No. Dr. Harris, no. Ms. Herrera-Butler? No. Ms. Herrera-Butler, no. Mr. Honda? Mr. Honda, aye. Mr. Joyce? No. Mr. Joyce, no. Ms. Capter?
Aye.
Ms. Capter, aye. Mr. Kingston? No. Mr. Kingston, no. Mr. Latham? No. Mr. Latham, no. Ms. Lee? Mrs. Lowy?
Aye.
Mrs. Lowy, aye. Ms. McCullum? Aye. Ms. McCullum, aye. Mr. Moran?
Aye.
Mr. Moran, aye. Mr. Nunnally?
No.
Mr. Nunnally, no. Mr. Owens? No. Mr. Owens, no. Mr. Pastor? Ms. Pingree?
Aye.
Ms. Pingree, aye. Mr. Price?
Aye.
Mr. Price, aye. Mr. Quigley?
Aye.
Mr. Quigley, aye. Mrs. Roby?
Aye.
Mrs. Roby, no. Mr. Rogers? No. Mr. Rogers, no. Mr. Rooney? No. Mr. Rooney, no. Ms. Robo-Allard? Ms. Robo-Allard, aye. Mr. Ryan? Aye. Mr. Ryan, aye. Mr. Schiff?
Aye.
Mr. Schiff, aye. Mr. Serrano? Aye. Mr. Serrano, aye. Mr. Simpson? Mr. Simpson, no. Mr. Stewart? Mr. Stewart, no. Mr. Valadeo? Mr. Valadeo, no. Mr. Viscoski? Aye. Mr. Viscoski, aye. Ms. Wasserman Schultz? Aye. Ms. Wasserman Schultz, aye. Mr. Wolf? No. Mr. Wolf, no. Mr. Womack? Mr. Womack, no. Mr. Yoder? Mr. Yoder, no.
Are there members who wish to be recorded?
Ms. Lee?
Ms. Lee?
Gentlelady is not recorded. Ms. Lee, aye.
Any others? Anyone wish to change their vote? Clerk will toll. We have less than an hour to finish this bill because we will be going back in session on the floor on the Commerce Justice Bill. We have several amendments remaining. I'm tempted to try to shorten the time by gently pecking on the gavel when you're at the 3-minute mark, and if you feel compelled then to use the extra 2 minutes, we're not going to object. But I would hope that the speeches we've heard this morning all have been around 3 minutes. It's sufficient time for practiced orators to have their thoughts concisely put. So as just a gentle reminder, at 3 minutes I'll peck and hope that you would conclude soon thereafter. On this question, the yeas are 18, the nays are 31. The amendment is not agreed to. Mr. Moran.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will read.
Amendment offered by Mr. Moran.
Without objection, the reading is dispensed with.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, my amendment would prevent USDA funding for meat inspections at horse slaughter facilities because without inspections, they can't operate. Now, this, as you know very well, Mr. Chairman, is not a new issue for this committee. It was first added to the FY06 Ag Bill on the House floor by an overwhelmingly bipartisan vote of 269 to 158. For the past 3 years, we've debated this amendment during markup and have voted to add it to the bill each year. Unfortunately, the provision was dropped from the FY12 and FY13 bills during conference, and as a result, horse slaughter facilities were made plans to open in New Mexico, Missouri, and Iowa. In each of these states, constituents and state and local officials, though, pushed back against those plans. In New Mexico, the slaughter plant was opposed by the Republican governor, the Democratic Attorney General, and the State Land Commission, a veterinarian by training. Polls found that 70% of New Mexicans opposed horse slaughter in their state. In Missouri, attempts to open plants were rejected by local officials through the denial of water permits. A state bill promoting horse slaughter was defeated, and polls showed that 75% of Missourians rejected horse slaughter in their state. In Iowa, 76% of the public rejected horse slaughter, and the operators of a proposed plant canceled their plans following opposition. Fortunately, last year, this defund language was added to both the House and the Senate Ag Appropriations bills, and it was retained in the FY14 Omnibus bill that passed earlier this year, and so it is now the law of the land. The final horse slaughter operation under consideration, a plant in New Mexico, was blocked from opening by this FY14 language, and it's since announced it won't pursue horse slaughter any further. And just last week, the Senate Appropriations Committee voted to include this exact amendment, this defund provision, in its FY15 bill by a vote of 18 to 12. 5 Republicans voted for it, including Minority Leader Mitch McConnell. Now, there are very substantive reasons to support this amendment. Horses aren't raised for human consumption. As a result, they pose unique health risks for human consumers. They're often given chemicals, steroids, and the like that can be toxic to humans. The discovery of tainted meat could severely harm the U.S. meat industry. Such a discovery had a devastating impact on the hamburger industry, particularly in Europe. Inspections of horse slaughter facilities, which cost millions of dollars, divert those limited resources from inspection of other meat products. I'm just going to wrap up in about half a minute, Mr. Chairman. The USDA has included this defund request in their budget the past 2 years. And, you know, on a less pragmatic, but for many people as compelling a reason, I think horses do hold something of an iconic place in history and the culture of our nation, and that may deserve special consideration to some as well. But most importantly, the presence of horse slaughter facilities is forcefully opposed by most Americans. About 3 out of 4 oppose it, and voting for this amendment will simply continue current policy, and so I ask for support of this amendment. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Chairman Adderholt.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The consumption of horse meat is a very emotional issue to many of us in this room and in Congress. I'd like that we take the emotion out of the issue because I believe we have a number of critical issues and facts that we need to deal with. First of all, I think it should be noted that horse meat is consumed all over the world. We can't change that fact. It just so happens that here in our culture we have not shown a preference to horse meat in the same world that many places in the world does. Second, because of the demand for horse meat around the world, the United States exports approximately 138,000 horses for slaughter each year. That was the number in 2013. And once the horses leave this country, we cannot control how they're treated in transport or in their slaughter. This amendment is an endorsement of the outsourcing of U.S. jobs. There's been interest in opening process facilities in New Mexico, Missouri, and Iowa. But this stops job creation as well as the ability to ensure horses are inspected and processed with proper USDA oversight. There are quite a number of unintended consequences with this amendment, such as in damage to the environmental from feral horses, which is equally important. So, like I said, it's a very emotional issue, and certainly I can understand both sides of the issue, but I would ask that the committee oppose the amendment.
Mr. Farr.
I support the amendment. I represent a lot of rural area, a lot of ranchers have horses. They're concerned at what happens when people can't feed their horses or they dump them. But frankly, that's not been a problem. We've had now people rise up and create retirement homes for horses, retirement ranches. A lot of humane sentiment about horses. I mean, this is one plant in one state that might open to be able to produce an export that isn't consumed in the United States. It seems to me Mr. Moran's amendment, we've argued this till we're blue in the face. We've supported this in the past. Horse slaughter in the United States for human consumption is no longer tolerated, and we ought not to try to turn back what progress we've made.
Mr. Dent.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just rise in support of this amendment. You know, as has been pointed out, we debated this the last 3 years. It was reinstated into the 14 bill. Last week it was just included in the Senate FY15 bill. It's not a partisan issue. The consensus in Congress and the American public is that this language should be supported. Let's include it, move on. The horse is a noble beast. I agree with Mr. Moran's amendment. Thank you.
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I'm going to support the amendment of my friend from Virginia, but to say that horse dumping isn't taking place, unfortunately it is. And so I think over this next year, we need to take a look at our policy regarding horse slaughter, euthanasia, killing wild horses, etc. Because it's a problem, and we have to deal with it not just in agriculture, but in the interior. So I would hope we could work together, both in the Ag Committee and the Interior Committee, to deal with this issue.
Ms. Quigley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I also support this amendment. 2007, I was proud that my state, Illinois, outlawed horse slaughter, forcing closure at the time of the last horse slaughter plant operating in the United States. I have heard that we can't let emotions operate with what we do here or play such a big role. Well, emotions aren't just emotions. Emotions are often based on facts and based on what kind of society we are. Let's understand that the method used to kill horses rarely result in quick, painless deaths. Horses often endure repeated blows while conscious during their slaughter. We've often heard in this debate that this is about job creation. We have to ask ourselves just how far we will go to create jobs. Is this part of what we will do? Slaughter-bound horses are transported long distances in crowded conditions without sufficient food, water, or rest, and many are seriously injured or killed in transit. Horse slaughter is inhumane and has no place in the United States. Emotions count. Job creation can only take us so far, and I support the amendment.
Is there further debate? Gentleman from Virginia is recognized to close.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate the comments that have been made, and particularly Mr. Calvert's suggestion that we develop a comprehensive approach to this, because it's not a simple issue. It is complex. I will mention the fact that the number of horses in the United States actually declined by over 400,000 from 2007 to 2012. I do think that this is not the optimal solution to some of the issues that face wild horses and the like, but clearly the American people don't want us spending their taxpayer money to inspect horse meat when the only purpose for it is to send it overseas. So I would hope that this committee would continue to be consistent with its support of this amendment and not fund meat inspections at horse slaughter facilities. We ought not have horse slaughter facilities in the United States for that purpose or spend the Department of Agriculture money. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Question is on Moran amendment. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed will say no.
No.
No seem to have it. The noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to.
Ask for a roll call, Mr. Chairman. The noes have, if the noes have it, I'm going to ask for a roll call.
All right.
Sorry about that.
A sufficient number supports you, so the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Adderholt? No. Mr. Adderholt, no. Mr. Amade? Mr. Amade, no. Mr. Bishop? Yes. Mr. Bishop, aye. Mr. Calvert? Aye. Mr. Calvert, aye. Mr. Carter? No. Mr. Carter, no. Mr. Cole? No. Mr. Cole, no. Mr. Crenshaw? Mr. Crenshaw, aye. Mr. Cuellar? No. Mr. Cuellar, no. Mr. Culberson? Mr. Culberson? Mr. Culberson, no. Ms. DeLauro? Aye. Ms. DeLauro, aye. Mr. Dent? Aye. Mr. Dent, aye. Mr. Diaz-Balart? Mr. Diaz-Balart, aye. Mr. Farr? Aye. Mr. Farr, aye. Mr. Fatah? Aye. Mr. Fatah, aye. Mr. Fleischman? No. Mr. Fleischman, no. Mr. Fortenberry? No. Mr. Fortenberry, no. Mr. Frelinghuysen? Aye. Mr. Frelinghuysen, aye. Ms. Granger? No. Ms. Granger, no. Mr. Graves? No. Mr. Graves, no. Dr. Harris? Aye. Dr. Harris, aye. Ms. Ferrero-Butler? No. Ms. Ferrero-Butler, no. Mr. Honda? Aye. Mr. Honda, aye. Mr. Joyce? Aye. Mr. Joyce, aye. Ms. Capter? Aye. Ms. Capter, aye. Mr. Kingston? No. Mr. Kingston, no. Mr. Latham? No. Mr. Latham, no. Ms. Lee? Aye. Ms. Lee, aye. Mrs. Lowy? Aye. Mrs. Lowy, aye. Ms. McCollum? Aye. Ms. McCollum, aye. Mr. Moran? Aye. Mr. Moran, aye. Mr. Nunnally? No. Mr. Nunnally, no. Mr. Owens? Aye. Mr. Owens, aye. Mr. Pastor? Ms. Pingree? Aye. Ms. Pingree, aye. Mr. Price? Aye. Mr. Price, aye. Mr. Quigley? Aye. Mr. Quigley, aye. Mrs. Roby? No. Mrs. Roby, no. Mr. Rogers? No. Mr. Rogers, no. Mr. Rooney? Aye. Mr. Rooney, aye. Ms. Roby-Allard? Ms. Roby-Allard, aye. Mr. Ryan? Aye. Mr. Ryan, aye. Mr. Schiff? Aye. Mr. Schiff, aye. Mr. Serrano? Aye. Mr. Serrano, aye. Mr. Simpson? No. Mr. Simpson, no. Mr. Stewart? No. Mr. Stewart, no. Mr. Valadeo? No. Mr. Valadeo, no. Mr. Visklosky? Ms. Wasserman-Schultz? Aye. Ms. Wasserman-Schultz, aye. Mr. Wolf? Aye. Mr. Wolf, aye. Mr. Womack? No. Mr. Womack, no. Mr. Yoder? No. Mr. Yoder, no.
Are there members who wish to be recorded?
Does you want to vote?
Are there members who wish to change their vote? Clerk will tally. Mr. Pastor?
Mr. Pastor, no.
On this vote, the yeas are 28, the nays are 22. The amendment is agreed to. Mr. Cole.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will read.
Amendment offered by Mr. Cole.
Unanimous consent is requested to waive the reading, and it's hereby waived.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. This is actually a very simple amendment. I want to thank Chairman Adderholt and his staff for working with it. Basically, we're taking language that in the bill applies to the Federal Department of Agriculture and applying it also to the FDA, the Federal Drug Administration. And actually, it simply asks that we do what President Obama's asked, that is, we apply the very best science possible in making these decisions. And we direct the FDA administrator to ensure that at all of his facilities. This rises out of science, as we know from the debates we've had today, is sometimes a very tricky thing. And the idea that there's no values in it or that all scientists are equal in all subjects is simply not true. So this just simply asks that the FDA administrator make sure that we have the appropriate scientists who are experts in their field offering a professional judgment. And again, it's report language. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back the balance of my time.
Chairman Adderholt.
Yes, we will accept this amendment. We intended to include this language, but it was inadvertently left out of the final version. This language is very similar to what we'd already had in the U.S. report for USDA. So again, we accept the amendment.
Mr. Farr?
Just ask the author amendment a question, if it may, Mr. Chairman. What is broken needs fixing? You're taking a policy that applies to a Department of Agriculture and carte blanche just applying it to a total different agency. It sounds good. It's all science, but what is it that's broken?
Well, it is all. I take the gentleman's question in the spirit which I know it's intended. It is all science. It is to try and make sure. For instance, we think of FDA as only regulating, drugs that go into human beings. Actually, it regulates a lot more than that, as we know. And for instance, particularly in antibiotics that are used in the production of agriculture, those type of things. So all we're asking is go get the best scientists in the world in that area as well, and make sure that you're doing it. And again, it's not a legal requirement. We're not trying to set up some barrier, but we are trying to draw attention that sometimes, in my view, and in the view of a number of agricultural interests, that you don't have the best science. So we're just asking that standard, which we're using for the Ag Department, apply to the FDA as well.
So does this apply to all of FDA or just that which is in charge of food safety?
No, we ask that they make sure in every single area and again, it's consistent with what the President laid out in 2009. It's not inconsistent at all. We want to make sure the science across this agency is, again, the very best that we can get.
Well, I appreciate the author, and I trust your good spirit, but I have real concerns with sort of the broad brush approach to this.
Mr. Dent?
Just a comment on this. I think the intent of the amendment is quite good, but I know this is I think a provision that was adopted at USDA, and I guess there's an intent. Some people like to see this at FDA. This is a bit more complex. The nature of good science, particularly in development of in the pharmaceutical industry and others, is an evolving concept and definition. I'm just a little concerned about the impacts on this in the fields of biologics, where these, well, it's quite complicated. I'd be happy to yield.
Gentlemen, thank you very much. Again, this is what we ought to be doing now. There's nothing in here that's different than what the President laid out in 2009, what the FDA said they were going to adopt. This was originally intended to be in the base bill. There's no hidden agenda here. But again, this is what we're supposed to be doing. We're just trying to make sure that the FDA director actually spends the time and attention to do this. It doesn't happen in every case, and I don't think that's deliberate. I'm not accusing anybody of any hidden agenda. We're just trying to make sure that when, report language matters. People that are receiving money read that report language. We're saying, hey, hold yourself to the very highest standards. Make sure you're getting the best science in all these areas available. So, again, I understand my friend's concerns, and I want to assure him there is no hidden agenda here, nothing beyond what I've said.
And just reclaiming my time, thank the gentleman. There are some who feel that that if this good science definition were adopted in the public sphere, that may require the disclosure of significant proprietary information that is of concern, I think, to some of the folks I represent. So I just want to spread that on the record.
Mr. Coates, recognized for a minute to close.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, it's a very straightforward amendment. No hidden agenda here. Very consistent with the policy the President's laid out, and that the agency in the past has certified that it meets. So we're just asking them, please make sure. We've had some instances where there are questions, particularly related to agricultural industries. I want to make sure that actually top-flight agriculture scientists, people that are specialists in these areas, are looking at this, not somebody who's actually trained, maybe a very good scientist, but not trained in this particular area. So that's the intent of the amendment. I would urge my colleagues.
Question is on the Cole amendment. All in favor, say aye.
Mr. Chairman.
Aye.
Mr. Chase, I rise to yield some additional time to the ranking member, Mr. Farr.
Without objection.
Mr. Cole, I'd love to work with you on this. There's a lot of issues. I mean, it sounds good, but the unintended consequences, things that FDA is responsible for getting into, is e-cigarettes. How does this apply to that? How does the peer review process that USDA uses a lot, is that going to be as a scientific base? Is that what FDA is going to use now? I think your intentions are good, but I think there may be some unintended consequences. So if this starts unraveling as to problems, could we work on the language and make sure that it isn't going to have these unintended consequences?
If there are problems, I'd certainly work with my friend. That's not my intention. If I were worried about cigarettes, I'd be worried about cigars, not cigarettes. Again, something that I'm fond of, not something that I'm not. So,
thank you.
Question is on the Cole amendment. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, say no.
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 The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. Ms.
What do you think is
DeLauro.
Pursuant to the President's...
Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will read.
Prevents poultry that has been processed. I've asked to dispense with the reading.
Which number is it?
I don't have a number. It's the to prevent poultry that is processed in China from being used in the national school lunch program.
Chinese chickens?
You got it. Amendment offered by Ms. DeLauro.
You got that one right.
At the end of the bill, before the short title, insert the following. None of the funds made available by this act.
Without objection, the reading is dispensed with. Ladies recognized.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, the amendment would prevent poultry that has been processed in China from being used in the national school lunch program, school breakfast program, child and adult care food program, or the summer food service program. A bipartisan group of 11 members, including members of this committee, wrote to both the House and the Senate Appropriations Agriculture Subcommittee to encourage the inclusion of this policy in this bill, and I'm hopeful that we can now act in a bipartisan manner and take this common sense step to protect our children. In addition, over 325,000 people from each state across the country have signed a petition to ban Chinese chicken in our school meals and supermarkets. The petition was started by 3 moms who simply want to protect their children. China's food safety record is atrocious. Even Chinese health officials have described their food safety situation as, quote, grim, with, quote, high risks and contradictions. USDA has known about disturbing and unsanitary conditions in Chinese poultry plants for years now. You take a look at the record of recent years. The record includes reports of melamine-tainted milk powder, dangerous levels of mercury in Chinese baby formula, chicken fattened by illegal drugs, tainted poultry, pet treats, and many more issues. Last year, a Chinese poultry supplier provided Kentucky Fried Chicken restaurants with chicken fattened by large quantities of illegal drugs. Since 2007, pet treats imported from China containing contaminated chicken have killed at least 1,000 dogs and cats in the United States and sickened 5,600 more. As a matter of fact, the USDA warned pet owners not to feed their pets jerky from China. What has happened to these animals is horrible enough. It could just as easily happen to our kids. There have been more than 400 confirmed human cases of bird flu, with more than 125 deaths reported from China since last April. And yet USDA's Food and Safety Inspection Service last year deemed chicken processed in China to be as safe as that processed here, based on audits of 4 Chinese facilities, even though there were safety concerns at all 3 of them. In addition to which, country of origin labeling does not apply to processed Chinese chicken coming to the United States. I do not believe that one-off visits to plants make a food safety system safe, nor do they ensure that food safety issues will not arise at these plants in the future. As it is, our U.S. inspectors will not be on site at the plants exporting this processed poultry from China to see if it is safe. This should be of concern to everyone, especially to parents. Children are our most vulnerable population.
Would the gentlelady yield?
Yes, I'd be happy to yield.
Oh, you know, I understand this is something we all agree on, and just to prove to you that I'm not wanting to hurt our school kids, I accept it. I have the best intentions for our kids to eat healthy, so.
Amen.
So I will accept your amendment.
I appreciate that very, very much, and I am glad to understand. I have to. I'm going to ask the ranking member.
Support. The question is on the gentlelady's amendment. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, no. Amendment is agreed to. Now, see how nice we can all be?
Mr. Chairman, I am always nice.
Mr. Chairman, could I just make a point of inquiry on the gentlelady's amendment, realizing the vote is already
Gentleman's recognized.
The question is, isn't there a Buy American provision in the law already?
I didn't get to that portion, but you are right. But that is to buy, that the district can buy from USDA. USDA has a Buy America provision. On the other hand, the school district can also go to a private vendor, and there are no restrictions on that. As a matter of fact, if there is a cheaper bid from a foreign product, they can move in that direction. So that is further to the case of why we should not allow this to
Time has expired. Gentlelady from Ohio.
Mr. Chairman, I have a second amendment related to
Clerk
chips at
will
the desk.
read.
Amendment offered by Ms. Capter in the first proviso of Section 730.
I ask if unanimous.
Without objection, the reading
amendment
is
be
dispensed.
considered as read.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Members of the committee, this amendment goes to the same title as the former one, 730, which deals with the Grain Inspection, Packers, and Stockyards Act. And I rise in opposition to portions of that provision, and I urge the members to strike a portion of the rider because it prevents American farmers from exercising their rights of free speech in the bargaining process. If we allow this specific provision of the rider to go into effect, it would prevent the USDA from protecting farmers against large processing firms like Tyson's and Purdue, who may engage in retaliatory actions against farmers for speaking to public officials, including their members of Congress, about abusive practices, intimidation, and coercion that regularly occurs in the industry. Striking this portion of the rider would allow the USDA to protect farmers from retaliation for exercising their rights of free speech. In May of 2010, there was a hearing held. Agriculture Secretary Vilsack and Attorney General Holder went to Alabama to hear about poultry. And one of the biggest messages they heard from poultry growers was about the fear of retaliation if growers speak out about the abuses they face on their farms if their dealings with the poultry companies that control their contracts and their livelihoods are at issue. Here's an example. One poultry farmer at the hearing recounted what happened when he contested his poultry company's effort to add a new provision to his contract that included a mandatory arbitration clause which would have taken away his right to a jury trial if a dispute arose. When he took issue with the clause, the processing company refused to work with him. Absent other options, the farmer and his wife lost their farm. He said, "We chose to stand up for our principles," the farmer, a former infantryman and pilot in Vietnam, said at the hearing. "We did not give up a fundamental right to access the public court, which is guaranteed by our Constitution, regardless of price. I had flown too many combat missions defending that Constitution to forfeit it. It was truly ironic that protecting one right, we lost another. We lost the right to property." It is widely understood, by the way, in poultry circles that farmers who dare to play leadership roles in organizing a poultry growers group often suffer from retaliation. A hen breeder in Georgia was the victim of severe retaliation by his poultry company when he tried to organize a breeder hen grower association in his area to get farmers to work together in support of better contract terms. The company deliberately targeted him and delivered sick chickens to his farm. He was able to sue, and years later, he won his case after it was proven the company deliberately targeted him with bad birds because of his organizing efforts. We cannot allow farmers to be harmed because they speak to their members of Congress or local public officials. We must strike sections of this provision from the bill and allow American farmers to use their right to freedom of speech, including coming to see us on these issues. I ask members for support of my amendment.
Chairman Adderholt.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, we again oppose amendment. The section references language that is included in this bill are the same as what's been in previous appropriation bills. We had bipartisan requests asking for this language to be included again due to the overreach of the proposed rule. These sections of the proposed rule have been included in this provision since FY12. So again, this is not new language. This is the same that we've had. And so I would ask my colleagues to oppose this amendment.
Mr. Womack.
I oppose the amendment, and once again, as I said in the previous discussion about GIPSA, this whole provision concerns well-established legal precedent and affirmed by several appellate courts, because under current law right now, that in order for somebody to stake a claim, they have to prove that show conduct that harms competition. There's nothing wrong with that. And this amendment would go against the fact that to have an established claim today presented, you'd have to show harm to competition. So if GIPSA has its way, if this amendment were to be adopted, there would not be a requirement to show harm to competition. And again, marketing agreements, which form the backbone of these relationships, would therefore be in peril. So I would strongly encourage a no vote on the amendment. I yield back.
Mr. Farr.
Support the amendment.
Thank you. And, Mr. Chairman, in closing,
Little lady is recognized to close.
I just want to read the proposed regulations. A retaliatory action or omission by a packer, a swine contractor, or live poultry dealer in response to the lawful expression, spoken or written association, or action of a poultry grower, livestock producer, or swine production contract grower. Retaliatory action includes but is not limited to coercion, intimidation, or disadvantage to any producer or grower in an execution, termination, extension, or renewal of a contract involving livestock or poultry. They're trying to protect the farmers' rights. I would say to my dear colleague, you are taking them away by opposing my amendment. The Department of Agriculture wants to enforce these regulations so that farmers have standing and that they don't have their livelihoods taken away from them simply because they're allowed to speak about their conditions. What is wrong with that? What is wrong with that? And what is wrong with that is that the companies in this situation have too much power. Those doing the work in these houses don't have enough power. We need to give them equal standing in the courts and in their ability to come and see us and exercise their rights of free speech. Please support this amendment.
Question is on the Captor amendment. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed will say no. No. The noes seem to have it, and they have it. And the amendment
On that, Mr. Chairman, I ask for a recorded vote, please.
Recorded vote is requested, and a sufficient number agrees. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Adderholt? No. Mr. Adderholt, no. Mr. Amadei? No. Mr. Amadei, no. Mr. Bishop? Yes. Mr. Bishop, aye. Mr. Calvert? Mr. Calvert, no. Mr. Carter? No. Mr. Carter, no. Mr. Cole? Mr. Cole, no. Mr. Crenshaw? Mr. Crenshaw, no. Mr. Cuellar? Mr. Cuellar, no. Mr. Culberson? Mr. Culberson, no. Ms. DeLauro? Mr. DeLauro, aye. Mr. Dent? Mr. Dent, no. Mr. Diaz-Balart? Mr. Diaz-Balart, no. Mr. Farr?
Aye.
Mr. Farr, aye. Mr. Fatah? Aye. Mr. Fatah, aye. Mr. Fleischman? Mr. Fleischman, no. Mr. Fortenberry? Mr. Fortenberry, aye. Mr. Frelinghuysen? Mr. Frelinghuysen, no. Ms. Granger? Ms. Granger, no. Mr. Graves? Mr. Graves, no. Dr. Harris? Dr. Harris, no. Ms. Herrera-Butler? Ms. Herrera-Butler, no. Mr. Honda? Mr. Honda, aye. Mr. Joyce? Mr. Joyce, no. Ms. Captor? Ms. Captor, aye. Mr. Kingston? No. Mr. Kingston, no. Mr. Latham? Mr. Latham, no. Ms. Lee? Aye. Ms. Lee, aye. Mrs. Lowy?
Aye.
Mrs. Lowy, aye. Ms. McCollum? Aye. Ms. McCollum, aye. Mr. Moran? Mr. Moran, aye. Mr. Nunley? No. Mr. Nunley, no. Mr. Owens? Mr. Owens? Mr. Owens, no. Mr. Pastor? Ms. Pingree?
Aye.
Ms. Pingree, aye. Mr. Price? Aye. Mr. Price, aye. Mr. Quigley? Mr. Quigley, aye. Mrs. Roby? Mrs. Roby, no. Mr. Rogers? No. Mr. Rogers, no. Mr. Rooney? Mr. Rooney, no. Ms. Roby-Allard? Ms. Roby-Allard, aye. Mr. Ryan? Mr. Ryan, aye. Mr. Schiff? Mr. Schiff, aye. Mr. Serrano? Mr. Serrano, aye. Mr. Simpson? Mr. Simpson, no. Mr. Stewart? Mr. Stewart, no. Mr. Valadeo? Mr. Valadeo, no. Mr. Visclosky? Mr. Visclosky, aye. Ms. Wasserman-Schultz? Ms. Wasserman-Schultz, aye. Mr. Wolf? Mr. Womack? Mr. Womack, no. Mr. Yoder? Mr. Yoder, no.
Are there members who wish to be recorded or to change their vote? Clerk will tally. On this vote, the yeas are 20, the nays are 29. The amendment is not agreed to. Ms. Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment.
Clerk will
Amendment offered by Ms. Lee.
Dispense.
Without objection, the reading is dispensed with.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This very simple amendment. It asks for a report from the Office of the Undersecretary for Food and Nutrition Services detailing the impact of preventing former offenders from accessing food assistance on poverty and hunger, recidivism, and the economy. As many of you know, the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act, this was the Welfare Reform Act, instituted a lifetime policy preventing food stamp eligibility for formerly incarcerated individuals who were convicted of drug offenses. This was signed into law in 1996 by President Bill Clinton. This policy affects the most vulnerable families, including women and children. Last year, Yale researchers found that the policy makes it more likely for individuals and their families to experience hunger, forcing some women to make very difficult decisions in order to provide food for their children. The study also found that the policy makes it more difficult for people with drug felonies to access and successfully complete residential drug treatment that is often required as a condition of their release. Many of these individuals are women with drug addictions, Mr. Chairman. The majority are African American and Hispanic, and we're all aware of the ethnic disparities for drug crimes in the incarceration rates. These disparities show up in the disproportionate impact on the SNAP benefit ban. Evidence suggests that when people with drug convictions are denied food stamps, it is more difficult for them to achieve the economic stability that is critical to completing drug treatment and maintaining.
Committee will be in order.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, this it makes it more difficult to achieve economic stability that's critical to completing drug treatment and maintaining employment, all of which we know increases the high cost of recidivism. These people have done their time, they paid the price, now they're back trying to get their lives back together. 16 states have passed laws completely repealing this policy. 25 states still include some restrictions, and 9 states still include lifetime prohibitions on food assistance. Let me be clear. While I support a full repeal of this policy, and I've introduced a bill, H.R. 197, to do that, this amendment that I have submitted today would simply request a study to review the impacts of this policy on hunger, poverty, and recidivism. Nothing more, just a study. We've supported my amendment, of course, by poverty amendment, which says we should not be passing bills or policies that increase poverty in America. Supporting this amendment is just one small step toward ensuring that our policies do not increase or contribute to hunger and poverty in America. I ask my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to support this very simple study. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Chairman Adderholt.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would ask my colleagues to oppose the amendment. As was pointed out by Mrs. Lee, the existing crime and drug-related restrictions were part of the bipartisan Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act of 1996 that was known as the Welfare Reform Act, was signed into law by President Clinton. The law made the persons convicted of drug felonies subject to a lifetime ban on receiving assistance under SNAP. This law is meant to serve as a deterrent for committing crimes, and many federal programs have restrictions in place for these convicted as a felony. So based on that, I would ask my colleagues to oppose the amendment.
Mr. Farr.
Look, this policy is just too mean. I don't think people prevent committing crime because they're not going to get access to the SNAP program. I think the question is, do we want to rehabilitate our society and allow people to get back and become full participants in society? And I think this amendment helps.
Mr. Moran.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to ask the sponsor of the amendment a simple question. Is this not just a study you're asking for?
It's only a study. It does not change the policy at all.
I wanted to
Also, remember, this is drug offenses. People who have done their time, they're trying to be upholding American citizens. They're trying to get a job and take care of their families.
Gentlelady is recognized to close.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, it does not change current policy. It's been proven over and over again that denying SNAP benefits does nothing, mind you, to deter crime or drug abuse. This was a wrong bipartisan effort in 1996. It should have never happened. People who have done their time, who are trying now to take care of their families, should not be denied access to SNAP benefits. So we're just asking this committee to support a study, Mr. Chairman, only a study.
Question is on the Lee amendment. All in favor, say aye.
Aye. Aye.
All opposed, say no. No. The noes seem to have it, and the noes have it, and it's not agreed to. Are there amendments? Mr. Nunley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Got an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will read.
Amendment offered by Mr. Nunley.
Unanimous consent.
Without objection, the reading is dispensed with. Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Section 4205 of the Affordable Care Act requires that calories be disclosed on point-of-purchase items on food sold through vending machines. Recently, the FDA has issued a proposed rule that may be interpreted to require vending machine operators to duplicate posting by posting signage near the vending machine and others that disclose this calories at the point of purchase. Many manufacturers have already voluntarily begun disclosing the caloric information on the front of the packaging. So what this amendment does is offers report language that encourages the FDA to amend the rule to state that the calorie disclosure requirements that are met if they provide a clear and visible display of the calories on the front of the package of the food, they don't have to duplicate those on the vending machine. Make it very, very clear. This in no way eliminates any of the disclosure requirements. It's just a common sense requirement on small business that says they don't have to duplicate on the package and on the outside the machine itself.
Chairman Adderholt.
I'll support the gentleman's amendment. I agree with his intent of the proposal. The Affordable Care Act contained the mandate for calorie disclosure. If the purpose of this law is to inform consumers of calories and companies can achieve that goal in various ways, then FDA should be flexible in their final regulation, and there's no need to add financial burden to small businesses to fit a narrow defined requirement. So I would urge my colleagues to support this amendment.
Mr. Farr.
I would hope that the author would withdraw the amendment after the debate. This was given to us at 11 o'clock last night. There's a lot of unintended consequences. This rule hasn't been promulgated yet. It hasn't been finalized. I think it's very important that this nutrition labeling be clear and be where it should be, and to just take it in the middle of the sort of discussion stage of developing the rule and saying we're not going to allow vending machines to have it before we even know what the problem is, I think is a little hasty. So I would hope that it doesn't get adopted.
Mr. Bishop.
Mr. Chairman, with all due respect, a number of the vending machine companies want very much to comply but they've done a pretty good cost-benefit analysis, and if this language is adopted pursuant to Mr. Nunnally's amendment, it would be very helpful, because otherwise it is quite possible that each vendor that operates these vending machines would be have to pay about $42,000 per year. And that could be a little bit excessive. I've been one of those people that have been a proponent of sensible regulations. I think they should be based in sound science. They should be subjected to a cost-benefit analysis, and they should make common sense. I think that Mr. Nunnally's amendment makes sense. I think that if you subject it to a cost-benefit analysis, I think it would help those small businesses and those vendors. And, of course, I think that it complies with the sound science requirement for healthy consumption, and I think that everybody's happy. So I support the amendment.
Mr. Laurel.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. As the person who authored the menu labeling requirement that was approved in the Affordable Care Act, the congressional intent at that time, after many, many months of discussion, was to just add the calorie count to the menus, whether it was in it was large chains, no small mom and pop stores. It included vending machines to just list the calories per product, and that was passed. It was written into law, as my colleague Mr. Farr has pointed out, that there has not yet been a final rule that has been promulgated. It has been open to many, 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 many months of allowing for comment around it. I have met extensively with vending machine operators, and they were agreeable to providing such information as someone's right to know the amount of calories before they make a purchase. Once you've made the purchase, it's like going into a restaurant, and it's just the change. We're talking about McDonald's and Ruby Tuesday and all the. It has to be. You have to have 25 venues in order that the menu labeling apply, and it is just singularly the calories. And as I said in the past, I would hope that you would, Mr. Nunnally, follow the ranking member's request that there be an opportunity to discuss this, because I have extensively talked to the vending machine companies when we put this into place. And as I say, I authored that portion of the legislation in the Affordable Care Act. It was a freestanding bill at the time, and if we begin to exempt various industries for whatever reason on this, then we are not looking at how people have the right to know what it is that they're consuming. Once again, it is about nutrition, and once it is about good health. Now, some days you can take a look at a menu and you throw caution to the wind and it doesn't make any difference. You're just going to get it because you had a bad day, so you're going to do it, but people do have the right to know whether that is in going into McDonald's and seeing it on the menu board or getting the product from a vending machine. I would be happy to. Yeah, I don't know if I have time.
Gentlelady has 30 seconds.
Okay.
Isn't it true that what this amendment will do is will not change those requirements at all? It will just require them not to be redundant, so that if it's placed adjacent where it's in plain view, that it will still be accessible, still be readable by
it really is by product. I say that to my colleague with all due respect. As I said, I've spent a lot of time on this issue. It is by product. Today you can go into Starbucks and you can see what a piece of pound cake, you can see what a muffin, you can see this, and they just put the label right, it's there, it just tells you the amount of calories. It is also, if you're taking it just lists the calories, so it is not redundant, and it is at the Oftentimes people say they have the information somewhere, but it is at the point of purchase, so that when you put the nickel in, you know precisely what that bar or what it is in terms of calories. So I would I would hope my colleagues would not support.
Mr. Dunley is recognized to close.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The amendment doesn't have anything to do with McDonald's or Starbucks or Ruby Tuesdays. It only has to do with vending machines and duplication of small business. That if the caloric information is clearly labeled on the package, it doesn't have to be duplicated outside the machine. So I urge the passage of the amendment.
The question is on the Nunley amendment. All in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed will say no.
No.
The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. Are there further amendments?
Yes.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment of the desk.
Clerk will read.
Amendment offered by Ms. DeLauro, page 78, beginning line 24, strike section 738 and redesignate this.
Without objection, the reading is dispensed with.
The amendment at the desk would strike the language adding white potatoes to the bundle of food eligible. Yes. With tears in my eyes. Yes. Want to talk about science? Let's have a science discussion here today. The amendment of the desk to strike the language adding white potatoes to the bundle of food eligible in the Women and Infant Children Feeding Program. The foods allowed in the WIC shopping cart should be based, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. Committee is not in order, and I sit and listen to many people that I have serious disagreements with and try to be polite. The foods allowed in the WIC shopping cart should be based on sound science. Let me repeat, sound science, which we are all for. WIC is one of our country's most successful federal programs. Last year, in over 10,000 clinics across all 50 states, over 9 million low-income women and children under 5, just over half of all the babies born in America, got access to healthy food nutrition information and the health care they need to thrive. One of the primary drivers of WIC's success is its science-driven and evidence-based public health focus. Since 1972, Congress, in a bipartisan fashion, allowed the decisions regarding WIC foods to be made by scientists and nutritional experts. Until this bill before us, we have never before prescribed the details of federal nutrition programs. Not ever. This is unprecedented. But now, by trying to force WIC to add white potatoes, it seems that the committee is trying to put industry interests, profits, before the interests of family and children. We should not start playing the game of promoting one particular industry or an individual's district local crops for a program that is designed to provide a complete nutritional diet for women and children. The Institute of Medicine has already weighed in with science and evidence-based recommendations regarding what should be included in the WIC food bundle. It's their job. They considered nutrients and foods which would support a healthy pregnancy and child development, and which healthy foods are lacking in the diets of low-income mothers and children. What the report found was that low-income children consume more starchy vegetables than the dietary guidelines recommended. 80% of starchy vegetables consumed were white potatoes. It found that children underconsumed every other type of vegetable. White potatoes were the most widely consumed vegetable and made up 40% of a young children's total vegetable intake. So they determined that white potatoes need not be allowed because most Americans already consume enough of the staple. In fact, the key issue is that WIC provides foods that are both healthy and lacking in the diets of pregnant women and children. White potatoes are already the most consumed vegetable in America. Instead, vouchers need to be used for produce, leafy greens that are not consumed as often and would have a greater nutritional impact. Not to say that white potatoes are unhealthy. They contain minerals and they contain vitamins, but they are available for purchase by WIC mothers using their personal grocery funds or SNAP benefits. This is not my personal recommendation. This is what the scientists and the nutritionists say. They should be the ones that are driving the decisions. We don't need to break what is working well through congressional interference, start a race to the bottom where every member tries to get their home district crop choice squeezed into a nutrition program that is already working wonders. This is the same type of thinking from Congress that got pizza called a vegetable. I urge my colleagues to support this amendment.
Before I recognize the chairman, the floor is holding up operations on the CJS bill there while we finish here. So I would hope that we could be as brief as we can so we won't hold up the House any further. Chairman Adderholt.
Oh, I believe the WIC participants should be able to access all fresh fruits and vegetables. White potatoes are the only fresh fruit or vegetable excluded from WIC. This provision would give for participants the ability to choose any fresh item for their family, the one that's in the main bill. So no one's forcing WIC participants to purchase potatoes. It simply gives them another choice. So I would urge my colleagues to oppose the amendment.
Mr. Farr?
Mr. Chairman, I support this amendment, and it's a very serious amendment. You know, the WIC program, it was pointed out, is the women, infant, and children, and what we do is try to supplement. It's supplemental vouchers they get to use vouchers in the stores to buy nutritious products. And it is scientifically recommended that potatoes not be part of the voucher system. Why? Because as we know, there's no lack of potatoes in anybody's diet. The average American consumes 90 pounds of potatoes a year. Everybody in this room, they have potatoes for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. The voucher is only $8 to $10 a month. That's not a lot of money. And this is a marketing program. What the highly respected letter from the American Academy of Pediatrics and the March of Dimes and other groups said that white potatoes are the most widely consumed vegetable, and WIC participants already consume them in recommended amounts. Thus, WIC participants' diets do not need to be supplemented with additional potatoes. You know, I was saying it's almost like a joke. We really want to recommend that people get access to early childhood nutrition. We think of milk products, and we serve milk. They have soy milk, they can have powdered milk, there's all kinds of alternatives in milk. And I asked my staff, I said, well, now what? Is it going to have potato milk? And they said, that's what we call vodka. But the point is, we don't need more potatoes in the WIC program. That's a limited amount of money, and we ought to leave it for the purposes for which the program was intended.
Mr. Simpson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As you might suspect, I would be opposed to this amendment, scientifically based opposed to this amendment. Some people think this is going to be opening the door. I don't think this allows for the future inclusion of Twinkies in the WIC program. Medium-sized potato contains more potassium than a banana and is a good source of dietary fiber, both of which are nutrients of concern, meaning those nutrients most lacking in Americans' diets, according to the USDA 2010 dietary guidelines. Potatoes contain folate, which is especially important during pregnancy. WIC participants do not overconsume fresh white potatoes. Data from the Centers for Disease Control 2005 to 2008. National Health and Nutritional Examination Survey shows that WIC women consumed only 2.1% of their total calories from fresh white potatoes, while non-WIC participants consume 2.4% of their calories from potatoes, scientifically based. Potatoes do not crowd out other vegetables, according to the 2006 study designed to mimic the WIC fruit and vegetable program and published by the Journal on American Dietetic Association. WIC-eligible women purchased carrots, tomatoes, lettuce, broccoli more frequently than potatoes. In 2010, dietary guidelines for Americans calls for more than 50% increase per week of starchy vegetable consumption in a 2,000-calorie diet compared to the 2005 DGA. The reality is that they've been using information that is 2 decades old. 2 decades old. They haven't been using the latest dietary guidelines when they came up with this rule. So we could argue the science till the cows come home. But remember, we're not talking about the good stuff. Potato chips, French fries, tater tots, that kind of stuff. We're talking about fresh white potatoes. That's all we're talking about. Now let me tell you what's really stupid about this rule. And if anyone in this room can explain this to me, I would be amazed. I got 2 sacks of potatoes here. These happen to both come from Idaho. Guess what? Participants in WIC can buy this sack of potatoes. They can't buy this sack of potatoes. Does that seem silly to you? Is this a nutritional guideline that we've got? You know the difference? These were bought at a grocery store. These were bought at a farmer's market. Same potatoes. I can go to the Eastern market down here and buy potatoes on my WIC program, but I can't go down the street to Safeways and buy those potatoes. Does this make sense to you? Is this a program that was established for nutritional guidelines? We've asked the department to revisit their rule and use the latest science. But so far they've refused to do that. And you heard some of the diatribe against potatoes by the ranking member in her opening statement and by Ms. Lee's reading of the First Lady's letter. It's all nonsense. I urge you to oppose this amendment.
There being no further discussion, the gentlelady is recognized to close. Ms. Galaro.
I want to make a quick comment, not because I want to get argumentative with my friend. The issue with potatoes, and there are some benefits to it, as you stated. The issue with the potatoes is the glycemic index, the thing that spikes your blood sugar. So for potatoes, they actually have a higher glycemic index between 65 and 80 than pure table sugar. And the issue we keep talking about and we keep getting back to is we've got to address the issue of diabetes that are more concentrated in poorer Americans that receive this kind of help. So we're not against potatoes, and there are some benefits, but if we have this national epidemic that's happening here, and we know from the science that the glycemic index for a potato is so much higher, we should take some steps to try to curb it. And I think the gentlelady's altogether appropriate to do so.
Would the gentleman yield?
We have a hard stop at 12:40, which is 2.5 minutes.
Would the gentleman yield just for a quick question? Do you know what the glycemic index of orange juice is, which you can get on the WIC program?
Yeah, and I think
it's exceedingly high.
It is high, and it's high for all fruit
Thank
juices.
The gentlelady's recognized for 1 minute to close.
We need to steer our policies towards more. I should at least be allowed to respond. We should steer our policies to fruits and vegetables that are healthy. Those are the same products, and you can laugh all you want. We've got a diabetes epidemic that I don't think is very funny. And we better start curbing our policies here to address some of these issues, because you'll be the first one screaming on the other side that we don't have enough money in the Medicaid program and we got to cut benefits. But these investments in the short term that will prevent a lot of these problems, including the gentlelady's amendment, are appropriate public policy issues that we should talk about and have discussions about and not make light of like and should be disregarded, because we will all pay the price in 20 years when half the country has diabetes, and the average person who has diabetes has 3 times more of a chance to have cardiovascular disease. Is that funny?
The House will be in session in 2 minutes, and that will shut us down. I want to finish this bill. Does the gentlelady wish to close? Gentlelady's recognized.
Thank you. I'd just say to my colleague from Idaho that no one has suggested that white potatoes are unhealthy. As I said, they contain vitamins and minerals. And the point is that because the issue is about them being in the WIC bundle of food and that program, because that the WIC recipient can purchase at a grocery store, or they can use it with their SNAP benefits. It is just not part of the WIC program in which the guidelines have been identified. Well, we want to try to support the farmers through the farmers market, Mr. Simpson. No, let me just step back here for a second, because this is not about, this is what the WIC package contains, and that it's been determined that because there is so much availability and use of the white potato, that limited amount of money in the voucher program that the ranking member spoke about doesn't leave money for the expensive fruits and vegetables, which we determined earlier were expensive on the market. It makes it much more difficult for the mother to go in.
Question is on the
and to be able to
on the
purchase
DeLauro amendment.
that
All in favor say aye.
vegetable.
All opposed will say no. The noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to.
Mr. Chairman.
There being no further amendments, the gentleman's recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I move to favorably report the Agricultural Appropriation Bill for fiscal year 2015 to the House.
Question is on the motion. All in favor will say aye.
Aye.
All opposed will say no.
No.
The ayes have it. The motion is agreed to.
Roll
call is requested. A sufficient number having requested.
We didn't have sufficient.
Those who want a roll call will raise your hand. A sufficient number.
Got it.
Clerk will call roll.
Mr. Adderholt?
Aye.
Mr. Adderholt, aye. Mr. Amadei? Mr. Amadei, aye. Mr. Bishop? Aye. Mr. Bishop, aye. Mr. Calvert? Aye. Mr. Calvert, aye. Mr. Carter? Aye. Mr. Carter, aye. Mr. Cole? Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Crenshaw? Mr. Crenshaw, aye. Mr. Cuellar? Aye. Mr. Cuellar, aye. Mr. Culberson? Aye. Mr. Culberson, aye. Ms. DeLauro? Ms. DeLauro?
No.
Ms. DeLauro, no. Mr. Dent? Aye. Mr. Dent, aye. Mr. Diaz-Balart? Aye. Mr. Diaz-Balart, aye. Mr. Farr? No. Mr. Farr, no. Mr. Fatah? Mr. Fleischman? Aye. Mr. Fleischman, aye. Mr. Fortenberry? Mr. Fortenberry, aye. Mr. Frelinghuysen? Mr. Frelinghuysen, aye. Ms. Granger? Ms. Granger, aye. Mr. Graves? Mr. Graves, aye. Dr. Harris? Dr. Harris, aye. Ms. Herrera-Butler? Ms. Herrera-Butler, aye. Mr. Honda? Mr. Honda? Mr. Honda? Mr. Joyce? Aye. Mr. Joyce, aye. Ms. Capter? No. Ms. Capter, no. Mr. Kingston? Aye. Mr. Kingston, aye. Mr. Latham? Aye. Mr. Latham, aye. Ms. Lee? Aye. Ms. Lee, aye. Mrs. Lowy? No. Mrs. Lowy, no. Ms. McCollum? No. Ms. McCollum, no. Mr. Moran? No. Mr. Moran, no. Mr. Nunnally? Aye. Mr. Nunnally, aye. Mr. Owens? Aye. Mr. Owens, aye. Mr. Pastor? Mr. Pastor, no. Ms. Pingree? Ms. Pingree? Ms. Pingree, no. Mr. Price? Mr. Price, no. Mr. Quigley? Mr. Quigley? Mr. Quigley, no. Mrs. Roby? Mrs. Roby, aye. Mr. Rogers? Mr. Rogers, aye. Mr. Rooney? Mr. Rooney, aye. Ms. Roby-Allard? Ms. Roby-Allard, no. Mr. Ryan? Mr. Ryan, no. Mr. Schiff? Mr. Schiff, no. Mr. Serrano? Mr. Serrano, no. Mr. Simpson? Mr. Simpson, aye. Mr. Stewart? Mr. Stewart, aye. Mr. Valadeo? Mr. Valadeo, aye. Mr. Visklosky? Mr. Visklosky, no. Ms. Wasserman-Schultz? Ms. Wasserman-Schultz, no. Mr. Wolf? Mr. Womack? Mr. Womack, aye. Mr. Yoder? Mr. Yoder, aye.
Are there members who wish to be recorded? Ms. Lee?
Ms. Lee, no. Mr. Honda? Mr. Honda, no.
Mr. Owens? Anyone wish to be recorded or change their vote?
3 days.
Clerk will tally. 3
3
days.
Oh, there we go.
On this motion, the yeas are 31, the nays are 18. The motion is agreed to. I ask unanimous consent that the staff be given the authority to make technical and conforming changes to the items approved today. Without objection, so ordered. If there's no further business, the committee stands adjourned.